feel as though white folks can be safely said to be among the most past-loving, history-loving, stuck-in-the-past folks on the planet. We love the past when it makes us feel good. It's sort of precious for white people who, at least some among us, have chosen over the last 8 years to go to rallies calling ourselves the Tea Party, which is, I beg to remind you, sort of an old-ass reference. Going in Revolutionary War costumes with powdered wigs and muskets, waving "Don't Tread on Me" flags. It is sort of interesting for people using all of those historical references to then tell people of color not to get stuck in the past when we are apparently stuck in 1774 somewhere, pre-revolution. Right? Sort of interesting when people tell others to not get stuck in the past and to celebrate the present and the future while they run around in "Make America Great Again" hats. The word "again" suggesting, does it not by definition, that we were once this fabulous place back in the past and that somewhere along the line we lost our way that we have to find somehow again. That too is being stuck in the past. Right? July 4th celebrations, that's sort of an old thing. Right? We didn't break away from the British last Tuesday. So when we set off fireworks on Independence Day and wear red, white, and blue and I Heart the USA hats and gorge on apple pie and hot dogs or whatever it is we do, right? That's in celebration of some really old stuff. I dare you, literally dare you, to go up to somebody at the July 4th parade and like right after the Boy Scouts pass, right? And everybody's feeling really patriotic, go up to the guy with the biggest patriotic button or t-shirt or hat, tap him on the shoulder and say, this is all great, but can I ask you a question? When might you be getting over it? And by it, I mean the revolution, because it was a really long time ago. And then you better start running, like all the time, because I have a feeling he's not going to take very well to it, right? White people love the past as long as it makes us feel good, as long as it venerates us and makes us feel superior to every other nation on earth, as if we were uniquely struck off from the forehead of God Almighty. Then we're very happy to remain stuck in the past. It's only when other folks, especially people of color, want to talk about aspects of the past that are a little bit less bright, a little bit less wonderful, bring us up a little short. Then all of a sudden, we decide that we need not reflect on the past. So it's obviously hypocritical to say the very least, but it's also problematic because it's hard, isn't it, to move out of the past when the past keeps coming back. See, if we really want to move out of the past, we have to make sure that the battles of the past are actually over. If they were truly over, then perhaps we could leave history in its easily designated spot. In 8th grade, American history classes, or 11th grade, or whenever we take them, right? 5th grade for some students, I suppose, college, right? We could just leave all that stuff there, mark it as history, and move on. But the problem is so many of the things that were extant at the time of Dr. King's struggle and the larger civil rights struggle, at the time of the struggle against apartheid and white supremacy in this country, the struggle for abolition, all of the struggles for racial justice and equity. So many of those things, albeit in slightly different form, continue to persist. You know, racism doesn't always look the same from one generation to the next. Like any system of oppression, it has ways of shape-shifting, it has ways of upgrading its own software, right? So you can go from racism 1.0 to 2.0 to 2.7, maybe even 4.0, but you're still on the same mainframe. See, the hardware hasn't changed. And you know how software is, like sometimes you do the software update and then that shit crashes on you and you're right back to square one, right? So sometimes that's where I feel we are when it comes to race. Because so many of those things are still happening. It's very hard to move out of the past when those issues continue to haunt. And so here we are as a country, 48 years and 8 days after the assassination of Dr. King, over a half century since the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. Soon we will be coming upon the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act in 2 years. And yet, in this country we have, according to the most conservative estimates that we have, roughly at least 2 million, if not as many as 4 million, cases of overt racial discrimination against people of color in housing every single year. People of color being steered into subprime mortgages with far higher interest rates, even when their credit records are better than their white counterparts, their occupational status better, their income's higher. Right? That's happening today in spite of the Fair Housing Act. 85% of all white folks in this country live in communities where there are virtually no people of color around. That is a level of racial isolation not that much different from that which existed 40 and 45 and 50 years ago. Right? We have a largely separate and highly unequal system of education, right? Whereby students of color, roughly 40% of all students of color go to school in K through 12 institutions that are overwhelmingly students of color. That itself wouldn't be a big deal if the resources were truly equal, but they are not, right? Those schools are 10 times more likely to be places of concentrated poverty. So obviously we're not only talking about separate, but profoundly unequal, which was the case 50 years ago and 75 years ago and 100 years ago and 150 years ago. Right? We have students of color about half as likely to be taught by the most experienced teachers in our K-12 schools. White students twice as likely to be taught by the most experienced teachers. Students of color about half as likely to have access to honors and advanced placement classes. White students twice as likely to have access to those things. Students of color 3 to 4 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from K through 12, even pre-K, because we expel pre-K children now. We're expelling 3-year-olds, suspending them from school at the age of 3 for being 3 and of color, because it very rarely happens to white children, right? And this suspension and expulsion disproportionality has very little, if anything, to do with actual rates of misbehavior. The studies on that are clear, right? That the rates of actual rule breaking in our schools are roughly identical across racial lines, contrary to popular belief. It isn't the case that black and brown kids break the rules more, especially the more serious rules. Most of the suspensions and expulsions are for subjective offenses, not for bringing weapons or drugs or fighting or being in a gang. That's very rare. Those offenses are much smaller numerically than the much more subjective ones of disrupting class, disrespecting the teacher, all of which very much in the eye of the beholder. And the study suggests that the overwhelmingly white teaching force is far more likely to see that kind of disruption in students of color than white students. So that's happening today, and that's happening 60 years plus after Brown v. Board said that, at least in theory, separate and unequal education was not to be allowed. It's very hard to understand any of this, however, we don't understand history. And I started thinking about this not only as an academic, as a scholar, as an activist, as an author, but as a parent. Because I have 2 daughters. My wife and I have a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old. And about a year and a half ago, they're both dancers. And at that time, they were dancing in the same dance company downtown in Nashville. And to get from the school that they attend to the studio, it's about a 7 or 8 minute drive. So one day I picked them up at school, we're headed to the studio, and to get from the school to the studio, you have to drive through a neighborhood that is a public housing neighborhood, right? And so on both sides of the road, public housing community, and we come up to the light, red light, and we're waiting for it to turn green. And the youngest of the 2 girls, who at that time was 10 and a half, right, she takes this opportunity as we're waiting for the light to change. She says, "Daddy, why is pretty much everybody in this neighborhood black?" Now that is a fantastic sociological inquiry. Right? It's a very important one, a very important anthropological inquiry, a very important political inquiry. Whether she understands the importance of it when she asked it remains to be seen, but she's about to know how important it is, having done so, right? Why is pretty much everybody in this neighborhood black? Now my guess is that she had observed that before. We've been driving that route from the school to the dance studio every day for over a year at that point, right? So it's not like she hadn't noticed this, but this was the one day that she decided she was going to ask. And probably the only reason she asked, let's be honest, is because she figured Daddy might know the answer, because Daddy talks about these kind of things. Right? If I was an accountant, she wasn't going to ask me that question. She was going to ask me how to do her taxes or something. I didn't give her an answer to that. But she figured maybe Daddy will know. So she says, why is it that pretty much everybody in this neighborhood is black? Now, her older sibling did what older siblings like to do, which is show out in front of Daddy. So the older sister decides she's going to interject. Before I can even say anything, she jumps in and says, redlining, which is scary accurate. Scary accurate. Right? For those of you who don't know the term, I'll clear it up for you in a second. Right? I don't even know where she heard this word. I must have mumbled it in my sleep or something. I don't know where she heard it. I don't think she reads my stuff, but she says redlining, and I'm like, and then the 10-year-old's like, yeah, I don't know what that means. And I said, yeah, neither does your sister. She's just showing off. But she was right, nonetheless. It was a good guess. So let me tell you what that means. So for those of you who don't know, this is a term for a practice that was done routinely for generations in this country. And it was quite legal, really, up until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. Even after the Fair Housing Act, there weren't really any enforcement teeth in that act for 20 years until the Congress added them in 1988. And even then, like you heard before, there's 2 to 4 million cases of race-based housing discrimination a year. Even with the law and the teeth, So clearly it's still happening, but let's just put it this way. Even if you didn't think it happened anymore, for generations, what banks would do, literally in this country, is they would have big maps on the wall in the lending office. They would take a red marker, they would draw a line with the red marker all around any neighborhood that was designated a black neighborhood, where the vast majority of the residents were black, and anybody in that neighborhood. Didn't matter your personal credit, didn't matter your occupational status, your income, none of that. Anyone in that neighborhood was going to essentially be ineligible for a loan. You weren't going to get a mortgage loan to buy a house. You weren't going to get a business loan to start a business. If you already owned a home, you weren't going to get an equity loan to add on to the house or renovate the house or any of that stuff. You just weren't going to be able to access any kind of credit from a lending institution. And so when my daughter says redlining has a lot to do with how neighborhoods come to look the way they do, she may not really know the history, but she's on to something, because in fact, that has a lot to do with it. That and another thing, the fact that at the very time that the banks were discriminating openly against people of color and allowed to do so by the government, the very same government was subsidizing housing for other folks, those of us called black. So it wasn't just that black and brown opportunity was restricted in terms of where they could live and what kind of housing they could have. It was that white folks' opportunities were literally being underwritten by the government. FHA loans, VA loans, later the GI Bill, all of which were in theory race neutral, but in practice were not. The underwriting criteria that the government stipulated with the banks for the FHA loans, for instance, said that essentially you couldn't get this government underwritten, government guaranteed backed up loan if giving it to you would change the racial homogeneity of a neighborhood, which meant you weren't getting one of these loans if you were black or brown and wanted to move to the new suburbs. And you also couldn't get one of these loans in a neighborhood that was viewed as of declining quality, and every black and brown neighborhood in America was designated as such. In fact, any community that had any visible black or brown presence was designated as declining. So segregation was literally subsidized by the federal government beginning in the 1930s. Keep in mind, public housing was created for poor white people. It was not created for poor black and brown folks. At least in the first few years, poor black and brown folks were almost always ineligible to even live in publicly subsidized housing. But once these FHA and VA and later GI Bill programs were created and white folks were able to access other opportunities and move out of the public housing projects where they and they alone for the most part had lived, people of color were then herded into those places, like concentration camps, with or without wire. Right? Let's be clear. It's a concentration camp when you put people there and you don't allow them opportunities to leave. Right? Even if it's a 2.0 version of a concentration camp, the effect is still very much the same. And so when my daughter asked that question, let's be clear how important it is that I know the answer, because what happens if I don't? See, I gave her the 3-minute version of the history, and that was all she needed that day. She didn't have to have a PhD level dissertation. I didn't have to give her a book, right? I just said, give her the 3-minute thing, right? And she's like, oh, okay. Now what happens if I don't know the answer? See, if I don't know the history, and how many of us don't? How many of us were really taught that in school? Like, you might know it, but I bet you didn't learn it in school. No. You learned that somewhere else. That wasn't in the 8th grade history, the 11th grade. I took AP history, that wasn't in there. I was in the advanced smart people history class, that's what they call it. Hell, it's so good that if you can get a 5, you don't have to take college history. You can test out of college history. Never take college history, and if you didn't learn it in high school, now you tested out of college, now you definitely didn't learn it in college. So it's a good way to keep you ignorant, because it doesn't talk about a lot of the really important things that have happened. So if she asked that question, and I don't know the answer, what do you think happens? Do you think that she stops wondering? No, she's wondering because her own eyes are telling her something's going on. I just don't know what it is. And here's the problem. If I don't give her the historical background, if I don't give her a sociological imagination by explaining to her what came before the thing she's seeing today, right? What was the predicate? Because see, that's the thing. There are no accidents, right? Only predicates. No accidents, only precedents. That which preceded whatever you see today. If I don't tell her what the precedent is, she's going to keep wondering, and you know what she's going to come to? What do you think she's going to default to use computer terminology? The only default position that she can conclude and arrive at would be what? The one that this culture gave her. What's the one thing that we've all been taught? Whether you're white, black, brown, anything else, whether you're rich, poor, middle class, whatever that's supposed to mean, whether you're from the north, the south, the Midwest, the West Coast, regardless of religious affiliation, regardless of any of that, what's the one thing every one of us has been taught by somebody? Maybe by parents, if not by parents, by teachers, if not by teachers, by preachers, if not by preachers, by politicians, if not politicians, by the media culture and the larger ethos of the nation. The one thing that we have all been fed since we were children was what? Wherever you end up is all about you. Right? That's the founding, that's the creation myth of America. It's the secular gospel of America. If we have a religion in this country, that is the religion. Right? Rugged individualism, the myth of meritocracy, the idea that whatever you get out is based on what you put in. Now, I know why we say that. I know it's not always pernicious in terms of its intent, right? Don't get me wrong. I tell my girls that, right? I tell them, look, you can be anything you want to be if you work hard, but I insist on putting the asterisk at the end of that sentence, and the culture doesn't believe in the asterisk. What is the asterisk in this case? It's the part that says, yeah, for that thing Daddy just told you to be true, understand something. You're going to have to not just work hard as the individual human beings you are, you're going to have to work hard as women, because as women there will be boys and men, and even sadly some women, who will look down on you because you were women and think that you were lesser. So you will have to not only be the best individual you will have to work harder and work to overcome those systems of sexism, misogyny, patriarchy, rape culture, etc. If I don't tell them that, I'm setting them up for failure. Some parents get mightily pissed when I tell them that I share that information with my children. But I don't believe in keeping the truth from children just because it's difficult. The idea that we should let them remain supposedly innocent when their innocence has already been snatched by the time they're children in this culture seems absurd to me. Right? I believe in telling my children what's out there so they know how to get around those obstacles. Right? To do anything else would be like sitting them down a dark alley where there's an electric fence at the end. But I don't want to tell them about the fence because I wouldn't want to make them neurotic. Right? Just go, run. I know it's dark. I don't know what's down there. Good luck. Wouldn't be much of a father if I did that. But the culture doesn't believe in the asterisk. We like the unvarnished notion of rugged individualism. So if you give kids that, and you never include the asterisk which gives you the historical and the sociological imagination to understand current phenomena, then they'll default to that idea that the reason those people live there, in that underfunded, infrastructure busted up, poor and lower income communities, because they're not as good. If they were as good, they wouldn't live there. They'd live over with us on that side of town, right? And the people on our side of town, why they must be better, because that's why we live where we live, And so you get the opportunity to not only reinforce racist thinking, but classist thinking, right? And sexist thinking, because if you're taught that wherever you end up is all about you, and you look around and you see white folks up here mostly, disproportionately, people of color down here disproportionately, rich folks up here disproportionately, poor folks down here disproportionately, right? You see men up here disproportionately, you see women down here disproportionately. Now it starts to make sense to come to racist, classist, and sexist conclusions. So you see, that's why it's important to understand history, because if you don't understand what brought us to this place, nothing will make sense. Right? So you look at who lives where, who has what wealth, right? White folks, typical white household today, 13 to 15 times the median net worth of the typical African-American family, 11 times that of the typical Latino family. It's not because we worked harder, prayed harder, possessed some superior investment wisdom. Shit, I'm staying around the corner from Wall Street. A lot of rich white dudes wrecked this country and this globe's economy, and they all had MBAs and high SAT scores. They were all very smart. I'm sure they had good IQ tests, Sure, they're all very bright, very well accomplished, but they destroyed the economy of the globe. In 18 months, they took $12.5 trillion out of the economy, either by their own illegality, unethicality, or incompetence. They were almost all white. They were overwhelmingly male. They were almost by definition well off. Right? $12.5 trillion. $12.5 trillion. That's 20% of the net worth of this country at the time, which it took over 230 years to accumulate, and they wiped it out in a year and a half. Imagine, if you will, if black folks stole or lost $12.5 trillion of other people's money. Not even in 18 months, just ever. Black folks, if they steal $12 of other people's money, if they steal $100 of SNAP benefits, they're going to jail for a decade. And none of these folks on Wall Street, or very few, only a handful, are going to see the inside of a jail cell, have ever seen one, will ever see one. Most of them got bonuses the next year. Mm-hmm. So you have to understand that it's not about merit or quality that explains that differential of who has what. It's about history, right? It's about the weight of the past and the effect of the past on the present. But if we don't learn that history, if we don't understand that history, we look around, we see the disparity, and we rationalize it. Right? So there are 400 white people in this country today, 400, who have the same cumulative net worth as all 40 million black folks combined. Let me repeat. 400 white people with the same net worth. There are more than 400 white people in my hotel tonight. They're not all those 400, maybe none of them, but you know what I mean. I'm just trying to give you a spatial identifier, right? 400 white folks, the same net worth as every black person in this country put together. Now, when I put it that way, most rational people upon hearing that would agree that it's not because 400 white folks have worked harder than all the black people combined. Like, when you put it that way, even the most irrational person probably is like, yeah, I'm having a hard time making sense of that. Right? But the culture encourages us to think just that. Right? The culture does, in fact, encourage us to sort of hear that statistic and go, well, God, they must be really smart. Huh. Right? Just like there are 37 people in this country. 37 people in this country who have the same collective net worth as the bottom half of the American population, which is 165 million Americans. 165 million Americans, including an awful lot of white people, by the way. On this side, 37 white folks, virtually, I believe, all of them white over on this side, who have the same collective net worth. Is that because 37 people have worked harder than the bottom half of the population? The 6 people who happen to be the heirs to the Walmart fortune, last name Walton, 5 of them born to the family, 1 married in, her husband died, she inherited the rest. 6 heirs to the Walmart fortune, they have the same collective net worth between the 6 of them as the bottom 40% of the American population, 127 to 130 million Americans. I want you to think about that. 6 people versus 127 million people. See, the culture says those Waltons must be awfully bright. Right? Well, they must be, because they pay their workers sub-poverty, sub-living wages in those cases. Yeah. And then make you, the taxpayers, subsidize their low wages by paying for food stamp benefits for them. So I don't know if that's genius or just evil. Right? Think about the irony of that. Your taxpayers, you're actually helping to subsidize people who work at Walmart because Walmart won't pay them enough. They pay so little that the biggest single demographic group in most communities of SNAP beneficiaries, what we used to call food stamps, is not black folks, it's not Latino folks, it's not even poor white folks as a group, it's Walmart employees. Whoa. $13.5 billion of SNAP redemption every single year at Walmart, overwhelmingly by people who actually work there. Right? And think about the irony, because that means Walmart is, on the one hand, they're saving money by not paying their workers enough on the front end. Then they get you to subsidize them on the back end, and then the Walmart employees redeem their SNAP at Walmart, put the money right back into the system. So I don't know if that's genius or evil. But if you don't understand it, see, you look around, you don't really understand what it is that you're seeing right now. Genius. So the past matters. History matters. It's not just an ancient reference. It's not just something we want to understand so we can do well on a test or graduate from school, right? It's something we need to do so we understand the phenomena that we're seeing. You can't understand the uprisings going on all around this country around police misconduct if you don't understand history. It won't make sense to you. See, it makes sense to folks of color because when it comes to police misconduct, folks of color know that history. It is etched in their DNA, if not genetically, if not literally, certainly figuratively from a historical perspective. Right? That historical, cultural DNA that we pass down, which is every bit as important and influential in our lives sometimes as the genetic DNA that we transmit to our children. So people of color know, for instance, that modern policing traces to slave patrols. And I mean that quite literally. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I mean that it literally traces to slavery. Because what were slave patrols? Slave patrols were things created by the rich to take working class people of European descent that didn't have a pot to piss in and have them control black folks to keep white people's property, rich folks' property safe. That's exactly what police do today. Right? Most cops are not rich, that's for sure. You don't get rich being a cop, right? Cops are working class. They oftentimes struggle financially. I lived in New Orleans for 10 years. When I was there in the 90s, the average starting salary for a police officer was like $14,000 a year. Right? Think about that. Right? Law enforcement officials having to work for these really paltry salaries, but why? They're protecting the those who have. And that's what the slave patrol was about. That's what ultimately modern law enforcement is about. It's about protecting the haves from the have-nots. It's not about individual officers being bad people. It's about a culture of policing, a mindset of law enforcement that's about command and control, domination and subordination, keeping the dangerous peoples in line. And we know that's what modern policing is too. See, it's not just the slave patrol that was that. Modern policing is, how do we know? Just look at what happened in Ferguson. And I don't even mean by that the killing of Mike Brown. I mean what happened after. I mean what happened when the cops rolled in to suppress the uprising there. Did you notice what they were wearing? And did you notice what they were driving? They weren't in patrol cars wearing dress blues with badges. They were wearing camo and riding in tanks that had been decommissioned from the Pentagon. Now I want you to ask yourself, why do you need camouflage in Ferguson, Missouri? You ever been to Ferguson, Missouri? You think they got jungles in Ferguson, Missouri? Because there are two kinds of camo, am I right? There's Southeast Asia Vietnam War era camo that's green to help you fit in the jungles of Laos or Vietnam or Cambodia. And then there's the Desert Storm to the present, Middle East sand-colored camo, supposed to help you hide out in the sand dune. I've been in Ferguson. They have no forests, they have no jungles, they have no sand dunes. So when you rock camo in Ferguson, Missouri, or any other urban environment, it's not so you can blend in and be safe. The only camo that would help you blend in most poor communities of color in this country is if you're wearing camo that looks like a pawn shop or a check cashing outlet, because that's the only place poor folks can get money in this country, in many communities. But that's not what it looks like, right? That's not what it looks like. It looks like the same camo the soldiers wear, which means that the camo is not about protection. The camo is not about fitting in. It's not about camouflaging at all. What is the camo about? It's about a message. It's about a symbol. What's the message? What's the symbol? The message is, we are at war. This is no different than Fallujah. We are wearing the same costumes we wore in Fallujah, driving the same hardware that we drove in Fallujah. We view you as the enemy, and don't you forget it. I could be a good, conscientious, caring cop, and you put me in that camouflage and in that tank, and you rock that mentality with me during my training, and I will treat my fellow citizens as the enemy combatants. See, that's how you can take even well-intended officers and twist them and distort them and turn them into something else. So that's why it traces to slave patrol, because it's about manipulating the working class, often white officer, on behalf of those with the money. You don't have to actually deal with them at all, right? See, people of color know that it was law enforcement that enforced the black codes, and it was law enforcement that engaged in riots against black and brown communities, along with the military, and along with average everyday white thugs in places like East St. Louis, Illinois, and in places like Duluth, Minnesota, and in places like Omaha, Nebraska, and in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? All around the country, from the early 1900s about the 1940s, there were regular race riots, or really, we should call them pogroms, right? Just orgies of racial violence. Law enforcement right there in the middle of all of it. It was cops and military officers that rioted along with white thugs and Mexican-American communities in Los Angeles in 1943 during the Zoot Suit riots. Latino folk know that history. We don't teach that in school either, right? People of color know that it was law enforcement that dragged civil rights protesters off of sit-in stools and turned water cannons on children in the streets of Birmingham. So if you have that history, we're just going to have to learn to understand why black and brown folks don't trust cops, right? It's not irrational. It's not playing of a race card. It's a rational response to an understood history. There's very little reason for people of color to presume good faith on the part of an institution that has never acted consistently in good faith in their communities. They know that police do not come to their neighborhoods to get their cat out of the tree, or to drive their children around and ride around, to show them just how gosh darn excited police are. But to be white in this country is to not have to know any of that. You can be deemed an educated person. You can graduate from high school. You can graduate from college with a history degree. You can, I dare say, get a PhD in history in this country and not necessarily have to know anything about what I just said, about the history of law enforcement misconduct and the abuse of police power in communities of color, let alone the contemporary reality. Because if you understand that past, then you understand the present. Then all of a sudden, stop and frisk makes sense. From a historical perspective. It makes no sense from a true law enforcement perspective, because you know the numbers. You here in New York, you know that 88% of the time, right, there wasn't even a ticket given to the folks who were being stopped. So they hadn't even jaywalked. There wasn't even a citation. There was nothing, let alone a serious offense. Less than 2% of the time were there drugs found. Less than 0.2% of the time was there a weapon found. But that was the rationale that the police chief at the time used and the mayor used. Well, you got to stop them first so we can get guns off the street. The hell, 0.25% of the time you actually got guns off the street. 0.25%. I could just go out here on the street and just tag people randomly and do better than 0.25%. I could just go and you're it. You got a gun? And then be like, yeah, damn. And what kind of I can just roll a ball down the street and touch people. And they take paintball guns and just show me your gun. Oh, damn, there it is. That's not real law enforcement, but it's a good mechanism of social control. Makes a lot of sense from that perspective. Same thing with the so-called drug war, right? We know that drug use and drug dealing, contrary to popular belief, roughly the same across racial lines, has been for many years, right? But who gets caught, who gets prosecuted, very different. Black folks 4 times more likely to be busted for a weed offense than white folks, even though usage rates are approximately identical, right? And a couple months ago, actually about a year and a half ago now, I wanted to actually know what that meant, because that's sort of an abstract data fact, right? So you have people of color, black folks in particular, 4 times more likely to be arrested for weed, even though the usage rates are the same. But what does that really mean in human terms, right? It's important to break these numbers down in ways that make sense at the human level. So I wanted to figure out how many folks is that, right? How many black folks is that who get arrested, who maybe wouldn't be arrested if the so-called war on drugs were really about drugs, right? In other words, if the war on drugs were really about enforcing drug laws and it was done equally, you can actually then estimate what's the surplus arrest of black folks relative to what it would be in a fair system, and what's the under arrest of white folks relative to what it would be in a fair system. It's easy to do that. You just take the FBI data on who actually gets arrested, and you compare it to the usage numbers for white folks and black folks as a percentage, which you can glean from the CDC, from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So once I got all these numbers together and I started crunching them, what I was able to conclude was that every year in this country, right, every year, roughly 160,000 African Americans are arrested for drugs. Drug possession alone, by the way. Drug possession is about 80 to 85% of all the drug arrests. It's usually not for dealing, it's not for manufacture, it's not for being a drug kingpin, right? It's just use, personal use, right? That 160,000 black folks every year are arrested for drugs who would not be arrested if there was not racism in the way that that war on drugs is fought. If, in fact, arrest rates mirrored violation rates for black folks. And there's 160,000 fewer white people arrested than would be arrested if arrest rates actually mirrored violation rates for white folks. Now, I want you to extrapolate those numbers out over a decade and start to tell me what you see. What that means is over a 10-year period, you got 1.6 million more black folks walking around with an arrest record who would not have had one but for racism in the justice system on just that one metric of drug enforcement. And you got 1.6 million white folks who don't have a record, who would have a record but for racial privilege in the justice system just on that one metric. Now you tell me, what does that mean in terms of who has jobs and who doesn't? Because folks not going to hire you if you got a drug arrest record. What does it mean in terms of your ability to vote and influence the political system? What does it mean in terms of your ability to go to college, because you're not going to get that student loan if they know you got an arrest record, right? So now all of a sudden you see that racism and privilege in the justice system on just that one metric, putting aside in any other area of the justice system, just that one, is enough to have a profound effect throughout the society. If you understand the history of law enforcement racial disparity, none of that is too shocking. I mean, the numbers themselves may be a bit shocking, but the concept isn't hard to get your head around. If, on the other hand, you don't know that history, then it seems absurd when black and brown folks insist that that's happening. It becomes easy for white folks to say, well, that can't be true. Because that's never, how can that possibly be true? If I know history, I expect it to be true, right? If I know history, I'd be stunned to find out that it wasn't true. But if I don't know history, I have the luxury of thinking, oh, well, it's not really a problem, right? I don't have to know. I can remain oblivious. Again, obliviousness being maybe the biggest form of white privilege when it comes to race. Right? Just like men get to be oblivious to male privilege and sexism under a system of misogyny and patriarchy. People with money can be oblivious to class privilege. Straight folks and cisgendered folk can be oblivious to, the privileges that come from being straight and cisgendered in a society of straight supremacy, transphobia, cisnormativity, etc. Right? Whenever you have a dominant identity, you just don't have to know as much. But not knowing a lot makes it real hard to decipher what you're seeing. And so it makes no sense when black and brown folks insist and they rise up and they scream Black Lives Matter and white folks lose it. What? But all lives matter. Yes, sweetheart. No buttercup. This is true. They do, and we need not say it. Because it is taken for granted that all lives matter, including white people. The problem is white people have a very long history of saying all and not meaning it. And see, black folks know that history. See, white folks said all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and then we proceeded to alienate the crap out of those rights for a really long time, perfectly legally. So we said all that we didn't mean it. So again, we have to excuse black folks when they say, yeah, we just would like to be specific. Like you say all, and this is our asterisk. We're putting an asterisk at the end of all, down at the bottom of the page. That means black people too. That's what Black Lives Matter means. It's not about my life matters more than yours. It's just about, like, don't forget the folks that you've made a habit of forgetting. That's like we have Black History Month and we don't have White History Month because we have May and June and July and August and all those other ones. You don't have to call it White History Month. It just is by default that, right? But if you don't understand history, right, Black Lives Matter seems like you're asking for some kind of special, preferential, life-mattering thing. You're asking for more life than me. No, sweetheart, we're not. That's not what's happening, right? So we have to be honest about it, but the only way we really can get to where people understand that, right, is by understanding history. Because otherwise it doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense. But it isn't just housing and education, also voting, right? It's hard to get past the past when the same battles that we thought were over a half century ago continue to come back. State after state saying now we got to have photo ID to vote. Why? We didn't need it 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Right? All of a sudden we need photo ID. People say, well, you got to have photo ID to buy beer. Yeah, beer isn't in the Constitution, Buttercup. It's not something that people fought and died for. People didn't get beat on the Edmund Pettus Bridge for some beer. People didn't die, get shot, get killed, get lynched, fighting for the right to drink. It's a little different. It's a weak analogy. Right? So why do we need photo ID to vote? Well, they say it's because we have all this fraud. My God, if you don't have photo ID, people are going to cheat. They're going to vote 5 times. A couple things. Number one, there have been 31 cases of in-person voting fraud in the last 15 years. 31 cases that could theoretically have been caught by having a photo ID or not having a photo ID. You can't even steal an 8th grade student council election with 31 votes. So this is not real. 31 votes. Secondly, who is going to risk voter fraud in this country in any real numbers? I want you to think about it. There's a reason that number is so low. The reason is, you have any idea what the punishment is for voter fraud? Like if you get caught, it's like up to 10 years in prison and like a $5,000 to $10,000 fine. Who the hell is going to take that chance just to vote twice? Like, has there ever been an election in your lifetime where the ending was tied, and if you had just voted twice, your guy would have won? Like, that, oh, damn, if I had just committed fraud, my candidate would have become president, but I didn't commit fraud, and I should have. It would have been totally worth it. Who is going to risk going to jail and having a $5,000 to $10,000 fine imposed on them just for the sake of voting twice when that second vote probably is not going to be the deciding vote? It's nonsense. It's got nothing to do with fraud. What does it have to do with? It has to do with, and sometimes they'll admit it, right? In Pennsylvania in 2012, one of the chiefs of the GOP, the Republican Party there, said that part of doing this was to flip the state to Mitt Romney because he knew that people of color, particularly low-income folks of color, were less likely to have ID. And they were also trying to keep students from using their student ID because they knew the youth vote was trending in a particular direction they didn't like. So they were saying, well, you can't use your student ID because students, they'll fake that. Yeah. Because I remember being 19 or 20 and thinking to myself as a college student, I need some fake ID. And you know why? So I can vote 5 times. That's a huge incentive for the production of fake identification, as I'm sure all college students will attest. My God, I need a fake ID so I can commit election fraud. So this was the argument, and in Pennsylvania, of course, they didn't say that about gun licenses. You could bring a gun license as an ID. Not a photo ID from your school, but the gun range. Because nobody would lie to get a gun in America. Nobody would ever do that. I'm sure you've never heard ever of a story of someone lying to get their hands on a firearm. That's absurd. So you can use your gun ID, you can use a driver's license, but who are the people less likely to have a driver's license? They're poor, they're working class, they live in cities, they don't have cars. They live in really poor neighborhoods, they don't have bank accounts, they don't need an ID, right? At least not as often, right? So even though the numbers aren't hugely different, I mean, most people of color do have photo ID, right? And most working class folks do have photo ID, but the differences are enough. 10, 11 percentage points. You might not think that's a big deal, but if it's a difference between like 80% of people having an ID and 69 or 70% having an ID, that's enough to flip elections, right? Particularly at the national level in close sort of marginal states that are sort of toss-up states. So we know it's not about fraud, it's about trying to suppress the vote among certain types of folks who they would prefer not to cast a ballot. So again, it's very hard to get over the past when these battles continue to come back around again, albeit in slightly different forms, right? There are even people who are running around now on the right who are saying that we need to have, literacy tests for voting or property requirements, right? Rush Limbaugh said on the air a few years ago that if you don't own property, you shouldn't be allowed to vote. Ted Nugent used to be a rock star, now he's just a hunter and a loudmouth. Somebody who, as a hunter would make even a pacifist wish that deer could shoot back. Right? He's on record as saying you shouldn't be allowed to vote if you're on any form of public assistance. Right? Wow. Judson Phillips, who's the head of the largest Tea Party organization in this country, has said the same thing. If you don't own property, you shouldn't be allowed to vote. Brian Fisher, the head of the American Family Association, has said the same thing. Elizabeth Hasselbeck, you'll remember her from The View, she's now on Fox. Her position is not that you got to have property, but you should have to pass a civics test. Which is highly ironic because, well, you hit my bar, but thank you. As a matter of fact, when she says that you need to pass a civics test to vote, what she obviously doesn't recognize is that the court has already ruled that that is illegal and unconstitutional and a violation of your rights. So in fact, she would be the first to have already failed the test just by virtue of advocating that, which is to say that she should be the first one to lose her right to vote, I suppose, even in her way of thinking. But this is the kind of stuff that's purely normative now. We're hearing this from influential voices in the culture, right? And again, if you know your history, you know where this comes from. If you don't, it all seems sort of bizarre or something we really ought not worry about. Oh, that stuff will never happen, right? Except that it has happened before, so it's a little bit silly to think that it could not happen again. But indeed, all of those debates are coming back around. And finally, we're seeing the same thing with our election. And I want to talk about that in the time that I have left before I take questions. It's very hard, I think, to understand some of what we're seeing unless you have a historical perspective on the intersection of race and class in American history. Right? Because if I really had to sum up this country's history in one sentence with regard to race and class and the intersection of those two things, if you really want to understand the history of the United States with regard to those subjects, the history of the country is this. It is the history of rich white people telling poor and working class white people that their enemies are black and brown people. The entire history of the country is the history of rich white people telling working class and poor white people that their enemies are black and brown people. That is not something Donald Trump came up with. He has not had an original thought on that or any other subject. One need not have very many original thoughts when one inherits $200 million from one's daddy's real estate empire. I should note as a side note, I find it fascinating that someone who can inherit $200 million from his daddy has declared bankruptcy 4 times already in his life. I don't know how one does that. I used to get $5 allowance from my grandmother. I haven't been bankrupt yet. So I'm not sure how you get $5 a week and you never declare bankruptcy, $200 million from your dad, and you do it 4 times just for the hell of it, and yet you're still considered an economic genius and a businessman of great repute. I guess that's a different lecture for a different night, but I thought I'd throw it in. Right? Here's somebody who is saying to working class white folks, because it's not people of his economic class who are rallying behind him, they're actually trying to stop his ass because he's making them look bad. He's telling working class white people that their problems are those Mexicans over there, those immigrants over there, those black folks rising up in the cities to protest police injustice, those Muslims from wherever in the world they may come. Right? Telling working class white people that their enemies are black and brown. This has a pedigree. It's not new, right? This is what begins in the colonies of what would become the United States. This goes back 400 years, right? Because 400 years ago, approximately, in the colonies, we begin to see the beginnings of this process, where colonies like Virginia begin to say, that first of all, the elites begin to look around, and they start to realize that African enslaved persons and European indentured servants have a lot more in common than they would like for them to realize, right? Because if I'm an indentured servant just one level above a slave, I got a lot more in common with the enslaved person than I do the rich person that owns all the land. I'm being worked, right? I may have freedom in 13 years or 7 years, but I'm essentially virtually enslaved for the time that I'm indentured, being treated in many ways very similarly. So there's a real risk that the working class indentured, not necessarily indentured, just the poor peasant European, right, who was never called white until they got here. Never called white in Europe. We didn't use that term. There was no pan-European unity. We weren't members of one big team. We spent most of our history killing each other. Right? White folks spent before we even started killing brown folks, we were just running around killing each other, trying to figure out who's the biggest witch. That was what we used to do just to ourselves. You're a witch. Well, you're a warlock. Well, I'm going to hang you from a tree. Well, I'm going to drown you in the pond. Well, I'm going to burn you at the stake. What do you think about that? Right? We still call these people freedom-loving. That's fascinating. Colonies were one of the most unfree places in the history of humankind, but we still believe that that's what they were searching for when they came here. And so what happens is that the rich in the colonies realize they better get these poor peasant European folk on their team. So you create the white race, you say, oh, yeah, you know that indentured servitude thing? Yeah, we're not doing that anymore. And we're going to put you on the slave patrol and let you keep those people in line. And then beginning in the early 1800s, we're going to let you vote. You know, we're going to give you just enough property, let you have some power. Just the men. We're not quite ready for the women. We're going to let the white working class men vote, right? We're going to let you testify in court. We're going to let you enter into contracts, even though you don't have any property. And, you know, we're not really going to give you any property. We're going to give you just a little taste of power, right? And it created what W.E.B. Du Bois would come to call the psychological wage of whiteness. This idea that, well, I might not have much, but at least I'm not black. I might not have much, but at least I'm not an American Indian. I might not have much, but at least I'm not Mexican and have my land jacked in a war of aggression. At least I'm not Chinese working on the railroads from dawn to dusk, because the railroad barons brought in thousands of Chinese folk to work and didn't care if they died, and many of them did, so as to build the transcontinental economy. Right? At least you're not them. And for those working class white folks, this trick worked. Because when you don't have any other currency, this right here, you can take that to the bank every day. And so that's what folks did. And then you fast forward to the antebellum period, you think about what the Confederacy did. These elites who want to break away from the Union and create the Southern Confederacy as a breakaway government, they announced openly why they were doing it. See, now my people lie. I say my people because I'm from the South, been in the South all my life. I had family that fought for the Confederacy, and they were wrong. See, but our people in the South will lie about it now. They'll say, oh, it had nothing to do with enslavement. It had nothing to do with white supremacy. It was just about states' rights. This abstract notion. What right do we think they were fighting for? Was it the right to tell Alabama the better recipe for a mint julep? Were they arguing with South Carolina about the proper way to smoke a pork butt? What were they exactly fighting for? Right? They were fighting for the right of those states to continue, at least their members of those states, to continue to own human beings and then to extend enslavement into the newly acquired, that is to say, stolen territories to the West. That was what the debate was over, and the elites admitted it. They didn't have any shame, see? That's the beauty of understanding history, because back in the day, they would tell you what they were about. They didn't have any problem with it. They didn't know that we would progress to a point where we might look back on them not so fondly. So they just straight up said, Vice President of the Confederacy says that the cornerstone of that government was white supremacy, the idea that the Negro was not equal to the white man. His words, not mine. The 5 states that issued declaration causes as to why they were leaving, they all said that it was about slavery. In fact, they said it was about nothing else. There isn't one other cause extrapolated in those declaration of causes that is not directly referenced as enslavement and white supremacy or indirectly connected to that. That was the purpose. But here's the thing, the rich, who announced that that was their purpose, to protect their property and enslave human beings, they didn't want to go fight. Because rich folks don't like doing the work. See, some shit doesn't change. Rich folks don't like to work. You can't even get rich working. You understand? I hope you understand that about capitalism as a system, right? Like, you can't really get rich from your own labor. You can only 40 hours in a week. I mean, there's more if you really want to work 80 or 100, but there's only 24 hours in a day. There are only 7 days in a week, 365 to 366 in a year. You cannot, based on your own effort, get stinking filthy rich. Right? The only way you can get stinking filthy rich is to get other people to work for you and pay them less than the value of what they create. Right? Now, we call that profit, and we call that reinvestment, and we call that added value, we call it whatever it is, or we call it labor exploitation. But whatever your final determination is, understand, you don't get rich unless you get other people to do stuff for you, and whatever they create for you, you don't pay them that. You pay them less than that, and you skim off the top the rest. Just understand, you can think that's a good system or a bad system. We don't have time to debate capitalism, we'd be here all week. But whether you think that's good or bad, at least understand that's how real richness and wealth, right, and power is afforded. So those rich folks in the South, they didn't want to work, right? They wanted to get other people to work for them and pay them either nothing or just the cost of the housing, the dilapidated housing and inferior diets that they were typically fed. And so black and brown folk did all the work that really built this country. In the case of enslavement, African-descended people did all the work that made the revolution possible, right? White folks in the South, including some of my family, sat around on big front porches with parasols and lemonade, mint juleps, went for carriage rides, and had ball gowns and big happy parties. They didn't actually want to do any work. Now, if I'm a working class white person in the South, why would I go fight for you to keep having those ball gown parties and riding around in carriages so you can keep your property? Why would I do that? That's weird, right? Like, if I'm the one that's going to have to go fight and die because you're too lazy to do it yourself, and you already told me that the war, that the secession of your government is about maintaining the property interests in slaves, and I don't own anybody. I don't even own the shirt on my back. That's how poor I am as a working class white person. I gotta charge you to work on your farm. I don't actually, I have to get paid. I don't own anything. I don't have any property, certainly no property interest in other human beings. So what is it that allows me to go fight? Because that's who ends up fighting, not the rich, the poor, right? Well, it's because the rich come to the poor and they say, if you don't fight to maintain our way of life, right? Our way of life, that these people are going to take your job. But the fact is that the slave already had their job, right? Because if I have to charge you $1 a week or whatever the going rate might have been in order to work on your farm, to cultivate cotton or tobacco or build the levees or whatever it is you needed done, to work in the blacksmith shop, whatever it was you needed done, right? To come up here and build Wall Street, whatever it is you needed done. Because it wasn't just in the South, we know it was here as well, right? Very few black folks have been back on Wall Street since they built it, right? But that was certainly who did the hard work that made it possible, yes? So if I have to charge you to do that work and you can get the enslaved person to do it for free because you own them, that person by definition already took my gig. Right? So if I'm a working class, poor, peasant, white person in the 17 or 1800s, I have more in common with the enslaved person. I'd be better off overthrowing that system and overthrowing the aristocracy that benefits from it. Certainly better off doing that than going and fighting and possibly dying for it. But the psychological wage of whiteness has tricked me into believing that the white team is my team. Right? Fast forward to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the union movement, you see the same thing. Right? You see labor union leaders in the AFL in particular, right, who publicly announced that they didn't want black folks in the unions, they didn't want Mexican folks in the unions, they didn't want Chinese or Asian labor in the unions. Why? Because if you put these folks in the union, it'll reduce the professionalism of their craft. No, it will double the size of your union. And that's sort of important when you go out on strike for a couple of reasons. Number one, makes your union stronger and more militant. Number two, when you go out on strike and you haven't brought the black folks in yet because you think you're better than them, and you go out on strike and you didn't bring the Mexican folk in yet because you think you're better than them, and you go out on strike and you didn't bring the Asian folk in yet because you think you're better than them, who do you think the boss is going to hire as the replacement workers, the scabs, to break your strike? They're going to hire the very people that you didn't want to work with, and then you'll blame them, not the boss. Psychological wage of whiteness. Fast forward to the present, and here we are. Donald Trump and others, but he being perhaps the most obvious articulator of this, right? Telling working class white folks that their problem is brown folks, if we can just build a wall, but not just any wall. No, a wall like you wouldn't believe. Big, beautiful door. Whatever the hell that means. And you all have been in New York a minute, any Trump translators in here. What is a wall that I wouldn't believe? I don't know what that is, unless it's like a butter wall. Maybe that's what he means, like a big, beautiful butter wall, which I don't believe. I don't think that'll actually work. I'm pretty sure it'll melt. Maybe that's what he's talking about, but if not, what is he talking about? He said we're going to build a wall because then the jobs will come back. If we can just keep those brown folks out, see all these working class white folks who have lost their jobs, all of a sudden the jobs will come back. You think that's right? You think that's right? Econ 101 says it's not. Right? How do we, first of all, demographics tell you that it's not. For the last 8 years since the recession, there's been a net outflow of immigrants. Not influx. Net outflow, because a lot of folks didn't come and a lot of folks returned to their homes because there just wasn't enough opportunity, right? The economy tanked, and yeah, it's starting to come back, but over the 8-year period, there's been a net outflow. So in fact, if there's been an outflow of migrants and the jobs still aren't coming back, we have empirical evidence that getting rid of migrants won't bring back jobs or boost wages. Right? That's number one. Number two, this is the Econ 101 piece. Do you think the wall is going to stop capital from crossing borders? Right? Is there some magic in the wall that, like, when I start to hit the button to transfer the money to the Cayman Islands, right? Or transfer the money to an account overseas, or move the entire plant to Mexico, that it's going to stop that? You've seen this video, right? It came out about, 5 weeks ago, Carrier Plant, Indiana, right? Carrier makes air conditioners, I think, or refrigeration units or whatever. And this plant, a lot of working class white guys in the video, right? The guy comes in from corporate office, has the suit on, gets up on the stage and says, just want to let you know, we're closing the plant and we're moving it to Monterrey, Mexico. And the room explodes with anger. Understandable, right? These guys are angry. This is their livelihood. That's how they support their families. And this guy just comes in and glibly tells them, oh, your jobs are being sent to Mexico. And then he says, well, we have to do it to stay competitive. It's a very competitive market. Well, the parent company of Carrier made record profits last year. They're a multi-billion-dollar, hundreds of billions of dollars a year, right? Record profits. They're not in danger of being uncompetitive. They didn't do this for the sake of competitiveness. They did this for the sake of their stock price. They did this for the sake of executive pay and for the sake of the shareholders who own stock in the company, very few of whom are going to be working class. They didn't care about the jobs. Now, who are those white men at that plant being encouraged to blame? The Mexicans for taking their job, right? That's who Donald Trump would have them believe is the culprit. But it's not like Mexico has some magnet down there that they hold up in the air and then corporations are like, shit, I don't want to go, but I gotta go because it's a magnet, right? That's not how it happens, right? Mexico's not responsible for capital flight and no wall will stop it. Right? This, again, Econ 101. If you close borders to labor, but you don't close borders to capital and goods, right? If capital can cross the border looking for the highest rate of return, and goods can cross the border looking for the highest price, but labor is chained to its country of origin and cannot go looking for the highest wage, by definition, you have just tilted the game in favor of capital and against workers. And not only in Mexico, in your own country and all around the planet. Right? But he doesn't want to tell the workers that. He doesn't want to tell white voters that. The wall's not going to stop that. Right? It's going to do nothing to solve the real problem, just like it's not going to solve that problem of 37 people owning the same amount of wealth as the bottom 40%, or excuse me, bottom 50%, or the top 1/10 of 1% owning the same as 90%. He's not going to solve any of that. Right? Mexicans aren't taking jobs. To the extent that Chinese are, and we're being told that too by Donald Trump, the Chinese are taking, they're not taking anything. Those jobs are being given by plants that are being moved by white elites, usually men who are doing it for their own purposes. And for the purposes of their corporate profits and the profits of their shareholders, they are doing it for themselves. And yet we are following, and this is the greatest part, right? People will say things like, they're being encouraged to think that because Donald Trump is rich, he can't be bought. That's what I like about him. He can't be bought like all these other politicians. What is the subtext of he can't be bought? Like, isn't the whole point of that rich people buy people and that's bad? So if rich people buy people and that's bad, we should just elect a rich person and cut out the middleman. Like, I don't understand even like the inherent logic of that. Doesn't make any sense. I don't like it when rich people buy politicians, so let's just cut out the politicians. Go straight to the rich people. What kind of logic is that? But it's the logic of the psychological wage of whiteness that is telling these working class folks that that will make their lives better. If you understand history, you can see the trick. And you can see the contours of the con that's being done, particularly with regard to the issue of immigration. Because again, if you know your history, see, none of this rhetoric about immigration can make any sense to you. Right? What is this rhetoric about immigration rooted in? It's rooted in this idea that these people are fundamentally different than us. Right? And not just different, but inferior, and particularly inferior to those of us called white. I mean, that's really the rhetoric, right? It's the idea that, they're just different. Our people, we came for freedom. But they're just coming for stuff. Isn't that the argument, right? We came for freedom. We had these high-minded principles. They're just coming for stuff. And like Trump says, they're not sending their best. The hell, you think England sent their best? The hell, you think Ireland, Scotland, Germany, Russia, you think Europe sent their best? No, the best don't get on the boat. The winners don't leave. There's no reason to leave. If you're winning, why the hell would you cut out? That makes no sense at all. If I'm winning, I'm not just going to give up It's not like sometime in 1645, there was some British nobleman sitting around the fire in his big-ass palace, getting his children gathered around the fireplace and saying, children, I've been thinking about this, and I don't know, this might sound a little odd to you, but let me just sort of run this by you, tell me what you think, all right, so on the one hand, last week, you remember we're at the King's Palace, right? Big house. We were out back playing with the King's children, riding ponies, running around in the maze garden, or whatever the hell we had in 1645. It was great, right? It was brilliant, right? I know, it's great. Forget all that. We're not going to do that anymore. In fact, Daddy has an idea. I'm thinking that rather than continuing to have all this gold and this really nice house, that we should just, 3 weeks from now maybe, just gather up a couple of things and get on a boat, a really big ship, a rickety old ship. I don't even know if it's seaworthy, children. We might sink and be eaten by sharks. We might get scurvy, get hijacked by pirates. I don't know. It could be awful. But if we survive, I think you will agree, once we get to our new home, that it has been a fabulous adventure. Okay, that did not happen. The people who came over, we say things like, well, my family came over on the Mayflower. All right. You don't necessarily want to brag about that. Do you have any idea who was on that and many of the other early boats? Let me tell you who wasn't. The king. The king wasn't on that boat. Nobody the king particularly liked was on any of those boats. He kept the people around who he really, really, really liked. The winners stayed put. So the irony of this entire anti-immigration narrative, right, is that it artificially divides us, those who came as immigrants in past generations, from those who were trying to come now. See, black folk know how they got here. And native peoples know how they got here. And a lot of Asian folks, particularly those that were brought over to work the railroads, they know how they got here. The problem is white folks don't know how we got here. James Baldwin said this too. He said the biggest problem with white people is that they still believe their ancestors wanted to come. He said, I know my ancestors didn't want to come, but Europeans think that theirs did, and there's the problem. Because if you think your people wanted to come, you think it was voluntary. They didn't. They were the losers of Europe. And that's not meant to be mean or pejorative or cruel. It's just true. The losers of Europe got on the boat, and there's no shame in that. When I say losers, I just mean the ones that weren't able to make it. They were starving, they were desperate, they wanted something better for their families. Many of them were convicts, rounded up and sent as indentured servants to work off the terms of their punishment, working for other people. There's no shame in any of it. The shame is when we decide that the people who are doing the same thing today, every bit as desperate, coming for the very same reasons, are somehow different. See, if you know your history, you can't make that division. If we taught our history accurately, we would see through that division. But because we're not told it, we're allowed to stay in this mythical narrative, right? This place that somehow says, I don't have to see me and you and me. Because we're not really the same. We don't operate on the same basis of moral principles, but we are exactly the same in terms of, nobody likes to move, man. Nobody likes to uproot their entire family and change countries. Hell, people don't even like to move across town, right? I've moved like 4 times in the last 15 years. I'm done. Told my wife, we just got our last house a couple years ago, I'm like, this is it, man. This is like the final resting place. If I die tomorrow or I die in 50 years, if we have grandkids, they're coming here. I'm not doing this again. And we only moved like 3 blocks. 3 blocks. And I'm like, I'm out. I don't ever want to move again. Now imagine if you don't even like to move across the street or the other side of town, or pick up and go somewhere to go to college or to get a new job, but within your own country, how much more do you think people hate having to actually leave Mexico, leave Guatemala, leave Honduras, leave Sri Lanka, leave Nigeria, leave Laos, leave Thailand, right? You know who wants to not come from, if there's anybody on this earth that would like Mexicans to stay in Mexico more than Donald Trump, it's Mexicans. They would love to have an economy that allowed that. But we have a global economy that has made that choice hard. Because we passed trade agreements that immiserate the Mexican economy. So we passed NAFTA in '94. What did that allow? It allowed for our agricultural companies, primarily corporate ag, but really just farmers generally, to take their surplus ag and dump it on the Mexican market. That wouldn't have been allowed prior to NAFTA. Now it is. So you dump the produce on the Mexican market. You flood their market with produce from the United States. That drives down the price. Again, it's Econ 101. Drives down the price that Mexican farm workers can get and Mexican farmers can get for their own produce. So now they can't make a living. They can't support their family. They go north looking for jobs. First, they go to large cities in Mexico. There's a labor glut. Again, Econ 101. They can't find work. They keep moving north. So to then talk about building a wall and deporting people, in this case, when we set these policies in motion, is like setting fire to a house and then blocking the exits when people try to leave. That's what we're talking about. But if we don't understand our history, we cannot empathize with the folks who are trying to flee that burning building. So that's why history is important. If you want to understand the housing crisis, the wealth disparities, the educational disparities, the criminal justice disparities, and the uprising that is taking place now in response, voting rights crises that we're seeing right now in this election, and the larger narrative of this presidential race, you have to understand that. And we as a country are so historically illiterate that we haven't emphasized that nearly enough, and so people are voting, people are choosing elected representatives without knowing that history. I'm not one who says they've got to know what to vote. I'm not saying that Elizabeth Hasselbeck is right, let alone those who said that there should be property requirements, but I'm saying that we've got to do better, right, as a country if we're going to survive in the 21st century. This issue of racial equity is going to continue to haunt us until we are honest enough to confront it. Like Baldwin said, these innocent people, and I might even extend that and say we as a nation are trapped in a history we don't fully understand, and unless we understand it, we can't be released from it. So if folks are tired of hearing about it, let's stop replicating it. If people are tired of hearing about it, let's actually fix it. Let's bind up the wounds and move forward as a free people together. Thank you all so much for being here. So we'll take some questions. We got microphones. We can bring them to you if you have one. And we'll take 20, 25 minutes of them. I'll let you get out. Cool.
Thank you. Just 2 questions. One, what are your thoughts on the whole Nixon or Lickman quote about the war on drugs? And the second question is to what was said in the beginning when people question you just being white, talking about this. What have the black folks that have trained you to understand what you know, what have they said about that criticism? Because obviously they've trained you to set you up.
Right. Well, the first part is really easy. The Ehrlichman quote, although there are other Nixon scholars who say that that just sounds untrue, actually it sounds entirely consistent with what we know Richard Nixon's views on race were, and other things that have been released since many of those documents were declassified suggest there's one in particular where he said something along, and this is on tape, said something along lines of, the whole problem is the blacks. The key is to act as if that's not what you're saying, or something along those lines, right? So you make policy knowing that the real problem is the blacks, but if you can just do it in a way that sort of hides that that's your intent, then everything will be okay. So if he's on tape saying something along those lines, I would say Ehrlichman putting those words in his mouth about the drug war, or putting those words in his own mouth, Ehrlichman's own mouth, about the drug war is likely true. For those who don't know the story, essentially, John Ehrlichman, who served in the Nixon administration, said that the war on drugs was essentially a way. They knew it wasn't about drugs, it wasn't about drug addiction, it wasn't really about crime, certainly wasn't about public health, right? That launching that wave of the war on drugs, which actually the war on drugs has in some sense gone all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, but it was ramped up for sure during the Nixon years and Reagan years. And they essentially acknowledged that it was about cracking down on black folks and hippies, anti-war protester hippies, that was it, right? It was a way to control them and turn the public against them, and arrest a lot of them and give them criminal records and ruin their lives. The part about the criticism of me, look, I'm one who believes that anyone who's white and seeks to do this work and does it in any capacity, particularly in a public capacity, especially more so than maybe private, but even in a private capacity, has to grapple with, as a matter of integrity, has to grapple with the fundamental contradictions, right? You can't not deal with that and have any integrity. And so for the 26 years that I have done anti-racism work of some type, the first 6 at the community level as a grassroots organizer and activist, and the last 20 on the road, 21 on the road as an educator and speaker and writer and all of that, have been years in which I've never stopped thinking about how does one do that job more accountably rather than less so. Because I realize that to be white doing that work, especially to be white and male, especially to be white, male, and middle to upper middle class, at least now, it's certainly not what I was when I started, but I'm doing better today than I was then, to be able-bodied, to be straight and cisgender, to have all of these embodied advantages and privileges, places a very high threshold burden, I think, on me to follow the lead of people of color, to listen to their direction, to listen to what they say I and other white aspiring allies or co-collaborators or accomplices or whatever term we like best have to do. And so for me, I was trained by a lot of folks of color, but particularly the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. And the folks at the Institute have had a lot of in very important constructive criticisms of my work, but always constructive, right? The difference between constructive criticism and destructive criticism is the difference between saying do it better or don't do it at all. I don't think we have the luxury of having people not do the work at all. I don't think we have the luxury of telling anybody in this country at this time that they can't be involved in the struggle for justice, especially when, and this is something I think sometimes gets misunderstood, I don't do this work to save black people. I think black folks can save themselves. I think people of color are fully capable of liberating themselves. Black folk, Latino folk, Asian folk, indigenous folk, all people of color. I don't believe they need white folks to get free, but I know that white folks are not going to get free unless we get involved. Because I think white supremacy damages me. I think white supremacy damages and compromises my daughters. I think white supremacy threatens all life on the planet. And if I believe that white supremacy threatens all life on the planet, first and foremost black and brown life, but it comes back to us eventually, right? Then I have a moral obligation to fight it. The accountability piece, though, is how can I do it better and make sure that I'm listening and following and being responsive to people of color. So I try to do that a couple of ways, and most of the time, I think it's understood, but I don't, if it's not, I get it. Like, I totally understand, whether it's people who are my mentors or people who hardly know me, sort of looking sideways at white folks when we try to do the work, because there's no doubt there's privilege in doing it. There's no doubt that the voice is amplified with or without this microphone. There's no doubt that the credibility that is extended is greater. But here's the thing, the folks who trained me told me that the important part that I played and that other white folks could play was, and it really wasn't them, it wasn't their idea. Again, there's nothing new under the sun. Other people had thought of this. It's certainly what, it's what SNCC told white folks in '67 when white folks were asked to leave the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It wasn't because they didn't have a role in the movement. It was because the black folks in SNCC said, we need you to go organize your people. We need you to work with people that we can't work with. It's nothing personal. We love you, but we need you to go and deal with them because we can't deal with them. And it's what Malcolm X eventually came to understand after he went to Mecca. He said the very same thing. In '61, he told that young white woman in Harvard, I think it was, that there was no role that she had to play, and he ultimately rethought that and said, no, what I should have told her was to go work and organize her people. So there's a long-standing tradition of this. The Black Panther Party was the same way. They worked hand in hand with white folks who were willing to organize in their own communities. This is the vast majority of the talks that I give, obviously. And the vast majority of audiences to whom I speak are comprised mostly of white folks at historically white colleges and historically white communities. That's the norm for my talk, because that's where I need to be. And that's following the direction of people of color who ask me to do that. And that doesn't mean I always get it right. Certainly not. We're going to make mistakes. Every one of us is going to make mistakes. I'll make some before the end of the week, I'm sure. Try not to make them publicly, right? But I'll make them. And when you make them, you have to own them. So what I try to do to be accountable is I try to bring as much attention as I can to the work and the words of other people of color, right? Whether that's in a historical sense, James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois, people I quote in my work, or whether that's contemporary activists who I support, whether it's folks in Black Lives Matter, Black Youth Project 100, Malcolm X grassroots movement, folks all around this country doing incredible work, leaders of a beautiful struggle in Baltimore, doing amazing work around police accountability there. All of these folks whose work that I support, I try to make sure that in my social media life, I send out links to their work, I send out recommendations about other speakers, other authors, other scholars, because I don't just want people to read me, come listen to me, I want them to go to the source of a lot of that wisdom. And so, I'm doing what I feel like what I was asked to do by folks of color, but also what I know at least morally and ethically is incumbent upon me to do. That doesn't mean that I can't do it better, and that all of us can't do it better. We all can, and we all have to try every day. Yeah. Other questions?
Hello, thank you for coming. So I would like to ask you, how would you inform people who call themselves white how to confront their own privilege?
I think, I do it most of the time the same way that I was told to do it. One of the things that the folks at the People's Institute told me when we first sort of headed down this road was, first they just asked me, why do I care about these issues? And I gave them some appropriately liberal answer that I thought sounded good, which had something to do with social justice. I think it was something along the lines of, since we're here to honor Dr. King and his work, right? It was something along the lines of, well, a threat to justice, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And something like that, which I'd memorized, and they were like, yeah, that one's taken. You need to come up. And so I went back to the drawing board, and they said, look, what you need to do is take inventory of your life, right? Because you obviously care about this for some reason. Take inventory of your life. Now, I tell other white folks, even if they aren't at the same place I was, let's say, when they told me that. Maybe they're not focused on it. Maybe they don't think about it. But I tell them the same thing. Take some inventory. Do some critical autobiography. Think about whence you come. Because what happened to me, when I actually started tracing that out, this is early 90s. I took a pad and a pen and just, started going in reverse chronological order, beginning that year, going all the way back to my childhood, writing down everything that I could remember where race had been implicated somehow in my life. And by the time I was done, I had like 10, 12, 15 pages, whatever it was, of material. And some of those memories were very sharp and very strong. Some of them were a little more vague. But it was page after page of things. And some of those memories were not about privilege. Some of them were about times I saw racism and maybe stood up against it. Other times that I saw it and I dropped the ball and didn't stand up against it. Sometimes that I might have actually helped perpetrate it, right? Or perpetuate it by my own actions. But there was a lot of evidence of privilege as well. And as I'm writing it down, I'm starting to see that, right? Because when you're having to remember it, you're actually putting pen to paper or, even now typing it out, on a computer. Either way, you're forcing yourself to recall certain events. And by the time I was done, I had a very clear image coming into view, right? Of something that I hadn't really seen. And it was only because I was asked to take that inventory that I was able to see it. So I tell folks to start with themselves. I don't need them to necessarily understand big picture systemic privilege right away. I want them to. I want them to see the big picture. But sometimes in order to get to that place, you have to start small. You have to start with yourself and sort of work outward. So I usually tell people to do that, to start thinking about everything from where they grew up to where their parents grew up to the kind of jobs that they've had, how they got those jobs, how did they come to be where they are in life. One of the things I do in my newest book, Under the Affluence, is I talk about the importance of creating counter narratives to this notion of rugged individualism, right? That one of the reasons that we find it so easy to look down on people, whether it's poor folks of any color, whether it's folks of color regardless of class, whether it's, whatever group it is that we're stigmatizing. The only reason that we're able to do that is because to some extent we really think that if we've made it, whatever that means, right? If we're successful or doing okay, that it's because we've worked harder. If we actually had to confront our real narrative about how we actually got where we are, if we had to actually reconstruct that and think about all the help we've gotten, and I don't just mean like white skin privilege help or male privilege help, I mean just like mentors that you just got lucky to meet because you knew somebody who hooked you up with them. Or luck, like somebody you met just as you were in the right place at the right time. Like all of these things that intervene, that create opportunity, create privilege, create access. And if we actually could think about that, every one of us, that's not just white folk, everyone in this room has had whatever accomplishment that you've had in life, you had help getting there, right? That's the thing about the rugged individualism thing, is it's such a dangerous myth. There's never been such a thing in the history of human beings. Human beings are by definition a social species. We live in groups. Nobody was born and raised on an island by a platypus or a porpoise or whatever the hell lives on an island, right? A wild boar, whatever it is that's on the island. Like, you know, if you've ever met a rugged individual, you better run from that person because they're going to be dangerous and feral. They're not going to know they're not supposed to eat you. They're going to do all kinds of crazy things. So I feel like if we could just start by doing that, let's just confront what is our real story. Not the story we tell, but the story we don't tell about all the help that we've had. Because once that begins to come into view, right? It's like those children's magic eye books, right? You ever see those magic? My kids used to love these, right? It's like some kind of thing, and you can't tell what the picture is. It looks like it's something, and it's like, what's the big deal? You're supposed to stare at it for like 10 minutes, and either you'll have seizures, or you'll see this thing pop out in like 3D, right? Oh my God, it's a unicorn. Oh crap, it's a leprechaun, you know? And it's like that. When you start to graft out your history, you start to see all this stuff that you didn't see before, and then it becomes easier, I think, to deal with. It's also important, I also tell folks, look, I want people to understand that everybody has some kind of privilege in this culture, right? So one of the things I think white people get defensive about when it's about confronting their privileges, they think they're the only ones who are having to do some work around that, right? So it's like, well, that's not fair. I'm having to do all the work and interrogation of myself, and what about other people who have other kinds of privilege? Yeah, they need to interrogate their shit too. Right? Because there's a lot of different kinds, and these things intersect and they multiply on one another, but everybody's got some. I've never been in a room ever, in all the years that I've been doing this, where there was one person in that room who didn't have some identity where they were the privileged group. Maybe they didn't have racial privilege or gender privilege or class privilege, but they were straight, right? Or they were able-bodied, or they were just at a college, right? Or they were just relative to the world's population incredibly privileged. Like everybody's got something. And I think that thing that you have is the thing you don't see, right? It's always easier to focus on where you got hurt. And it, you know, I grew up Jewish in Nashville. I could have stayed stuck there for a long time. Like, you know, one of 5,000 Jews in the city of Nashville where there's 3 churches on every corner, you know? Like I could have easily just stayed in that place where I thought about anti-Semitism aimed at me, or the mistreatment of me as a Jewish kid or whatever, teachers that would pop their heads in the room just to remind me that I was going to hell in case I'd forgotten since the previous Tuesday when they told me the last time. You know, that used to happen, but if all I did was focus on that and not the whiteness piece, I would have been fundamentally dishonest. So we all have got to, but at the same time, I want my Christian brothers and sisters to deal with that, right? They got to deal with that privilege that they were, embodying in that moment. So we all have got I have a friend and colleague who's now, I believe, retired, most recently from Middle Tennessee State University, Jackie Wade, African-American scholar and social worker, and social work professor. But she had a way of saying it in her work. I've done a couple trainings with her, and she says, we all have a couple of nickels in the quarter, right? Whether we're white, black, brown, whatever we all got a couple nickels in the quarter in terms of some kind of advantage we have that we need to be accountable for. And so I think if we can tell people, and we're trying to get them to own their piece, to remind them that we all have got some pieces that we need to own, right? I know I've talked to scholars of color, women of color in particular, in college classrooms, who, every year, right, when they're trying to teach this stuff, it's hard because the white students in their classrooms give them bad evaluations, right? They can't hear it from particularly a woman of color. And so one of the things that they tell me they do in order to break through some of those barriers, right, is to make sure that they go ahead and talk about their own privilege, whether it's as a professor with a PhD or whatever it is, whether it's economic background, whether it's being straight, whether it's being able-bodied. It's like, hey, I'm not saying you're the only one with it. I've got some of it. Everybody in here's got some of it. I just want you to own the parts that you've got, and we can also talk about the parts you don't have. So it's fine. Like if you want to talk about the part about, yeah, I'm white, but I'm gay, we can talk about that. Or I'm white, but I'm a woman, we can talk about that. Or I'm white and I'm poor, because every time we talk about white privilege, all of a sudden every white person is from Appalachia. I don't know. Like all of a sudden we were all born in the hollers of Kentucky, working in the coal mine, which is just not true 99% of the time. But the reality is there are a lot of poor white people who are hurting, in spite of their advantages as white people. And I would argue that part of the reason they're hurting is because of their advantages as white people. And that may seem counterintuitive. What I mean by it is the advantage of being oblivious to all that history that I just mentioned actually has put them in a bad spot. The privilege actually let them down, because the privilege said, all you gotta do is work hard and everything will be cool. See, the privilege of believing that. See, black folks never believed that. Latino folk never believed. Folks of color never actually thought it was that simple. Oh, well, I just got to work hard and play by the rules. Okay, then, I'll do that. Like, people of color knew that wasn't enough. White folks have actually had the luxury historically, right, of actually believing, I might be poor today, but by God, if I just work a little harder, I won't be, and my kids will be better off than me. And then, when you've been told that, and you've had the privilege of believing it, and then you come to realize the world doesn't work the way that you were told it works, you're not ready.
Yeah,
You're not ready for the shift. And so I want white people to reflect on their privilege by realizing how toxic it is. Because now 90% of all new heroin addictions in this country are white folks. Now why is that? Why is that? Why is it? And we're not trying to lock them up now either. We're trying to educate them and get rehab. 1973 in this city, heroin, it was black and brown, but they were locking them all up. 1980s crack, it was seen as black and brown, they were locking them all up. Now they're saying, we need to have compassion. They're right.
Because it's changed from a crime to disease.
That's it. Now it's a disease. It was always a disease, always a public health issue. But it's so now this is the irony. Now, why are white folks all of a sudden getting hooked? Why is it that white mortality rates for 45 to 54-year-old white men, non-college educated, went up through the roof the last 13 years? They had a spike of 200 to 300,000 excess deaths among middle-aged, non-college educated white men. It was the only demographic group that saw that jump. That's weird, right? Like even 45 to 54-year-old black and brown men without a college degree saw their rates decline. They're still higher than the white rates, but theirs are going in the right direction. The white rates were like, boop. And most of those excess deaths were suicide, cirrhosis of the liver brought on by heavy drinking, or opioid addiction, overdoses. So why would that group be killing itself with drugs and alcohol and literally killing themselves on purpose with suicide? The only thing that makes any sense is that they don't have the coping skills to deal with an economy that was pulled out from under their feet. People of color always knew it was a lie. These white men believed that by the time they retired, everything would be fine. Now they're staring 10 years down from retirement and they got nothing. And they don't know how to cope with the world as it is because they had the privilege of never having to deal with that. See, this privilege can kill you. That's how I want them to deal with it. Yeah. That's what I want them to deal Hi. Yeah, we're just going back and forth. Yeah, it's your turn.
Okay. Hey. My name is Michaela. I'm a sophomore. I just have a quick question. So, last semester, I had a roommate. She was kind of crazy. And she...
I had one of those. Not the only one.
Yeah, she was, a bit, I don't want to, racist is a strong word. I don't want to put that on anybody, but she was a bit privileged. And I went home with her, and like, her friends were kind of racist towards me, saying things like, never seen black girls before, or her uncle like actually called me the N-word to my face, in jest, but like, and I tried to set it aside, and say certain things like this they don't go well with me. I don't really appreciate it. And the card, you're using the black card, and you're in the north fought for the south, and
But they're calling you the N-word,
I
and
know.
you're playing the black card?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, how do I deal? My question would be, how do I mean, we don't talk anymore, but in future
Okay, so you
reference,
That's how you
I was going to say, like, hey, get a different roommate. Number one.
Yeah.
Tell housing, new roommate, please, or whatever. God, I mean, you just got to get away from people like that. Number one. I mean, I never want to tell people of color to suffer fools, gladly or not. Right? So I don't think it's your job to try to be understanding or to fix her. Right. Or let alone fix her uncle. If her uncle's going to be fixed, his niece needs to fix him, right? That's on her. All you can do is what you did, right? Which is say what you felt you had to say. and whatever you felt was safe for you to say, because that's a crazy situation to be in, where you're at their place, and I mean, you know, I'm sure there's more you wanted to say and couldn't, right? Because that's a frightening situation. But you know, it's the thing, you can't save them all, you know, and it's not your job. That's my job, and that's the white folks in this room. That's our job. We have to go get our people. You know, we have to deal with them. People of color y'all got enough going on just to try to get through the day, the week, the month, the year. And if you're in a good mood one day and you want to share some insights with us, hey, we'll take them, and I'll try to use them as constructively and give you credit for them, and I'll be happy to. But if y'all are just done one week and you're like, nah, we're just not even going to tell you anything this week, you just need to Google it all on your own. Then that's just where it is. Like, you don't have to be the cultural commissar. You know, there are those times that maybe, you know, that roommate wants to touch your hair and you don't want to hit her. And then there are those times when you must. And I hear that story everywhere I go. Right? The roommate who may not call you the N-word, but can you get that wet? Can you go swimming with that? Never seen that. What is that? You know, just Google that shit. Just learn yourself. You don't have to ask black women to touch their hair, right? So if you want to be the teacher that day, like if you're in a good place where you're like, let me explain the difference between this and this, God bless you. But, you know, it's not your obligation, right? That's the obligation of white folks to deal with our folks. And whatever you feel like, or whatever you feel safe enough to do, by all means do it. But if you're just done and you don't feel like doing it, don't feel that you have to be the one to fix us. We have to fix us. And as long as we're doing our job, you won't have to deal with that as much. I'm not saying you'll never have to, because there will be some fools. That's just the way things go. But if we were doing our job sufficiently, we would have dealt with that. See, we could inoculate against that if we were just talking to our people enough. And so that's our burden. That's our burden. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to say I'm very happy to have heard you speak in person. I've been following your work for years. My question is, was there a catalytic event, or what exactly compelled you to start to do this? Was there something that happened? Why did you start doing this?
Well, I think anybody who does this has got several moments. I doubt there's any one moment for anyone in the struggle, whether it's a white person or a person of color. I think generally there are a series of events that happen in the course of your life, many of them very early on, that influence, you know, who you're going to become. The short version of it is that, you know, I was raised in the South, lived in the South all my life, raised by a civil rights oriented family. So I had some advantages starting out that a lot of white folks didn't, in the sense of how I was being raised. I went to preschool at Tennessee State University, which for those who don't know is a historically black college in Nashville, so that most of my early peers in grade school, pre-K, you know, were black kids. I was at an early childhood ed program on a black campus in North Nashville, where most of the educators were African American women. So what that did in 1971, 72, right, was it sort of primed me, probably a little differently than most, in the sense that I was being educated in a non-dominant space where I was not the norm, and I had to get sort of used to that, right? I wasn't always the norm. I wasn't always the reference point, right? And that meant that when I was in elementary school and integrated public schools in Nashville, that when those black kids that I was in school with, who were probably 37, 38% of the students at that time, were being mistreated, over-disciplined, put in the remedial track, where the white kids were being put in the advanced track, I was the one who would notice it, because those were my friends. Those were the people I went to state with, or those were kids that looked like the kids I went to state with. So I would notice it. Most of the white kids wouldn't have, because being over on that side of the room while the black kids were over there, that's like their neighborhood. That's like every experience they've ever had. They wouldn't have noticed it, but I did. And it also meant going to Tennessee State that having black authority figures, right, as educators meant that when I'm 23, 24, 25, and I'm working in public housing in New Orleans, and I'm working in mostly black space, and the leaders of those communities are overwhelmingly black women in public housing, who were most of the leaders in those communities. And they're telling me what their life is like, and they're telling me what their experiences are. I'm not going to be the guy that looks at them like they've lost their mind and tells them that maybe they're exaggerating, right? Because I was taught to respect black authority when I was 3. and when I was 4. And so when a black person tells me this is my life, I start with the assumption that they know their life better than I do. But I don't start with that assumption because I'm a genius. I start with that assumption because I was conditioned to have that belief, right? And so that's the cornerstone. But that alone wouldn't have done it, right? I mean, there are other white kids who've grown up in black spaces or brown spaces. They don't necessarily do this work. I think the thing that there are a lot of other things that happen, and I write about them in White Like Me, my memoir, but the sort of the final thing, I think, for me, was that when I graduated from college, which was 1990, the very first thing I did was I started working in the campaigns against David Duke, who was running for U.S. Senate and governor in Louisiana at that time, former Klan leader, lifelong white supremacist, neo-Nazi since he was about 17. And he was running for the U.S. Senate in Louisiana and then governor in 91, and I was associated with that group that was formed to defeat him. And you know, if you remember those days, some of you in the room will, he came very close to winning. In 1990, he got 60% of the white vote. And it wasn't because people didn't know he was a Nazi. They all knew he was a Nazi. Everybody. There were children in utero that knew he was a Nazi, right? And I mean, everyone knew, and yet 6 out of 10 white people, roughly 620,000 people, voted for him. And in the governor's race, he didn't do quite as well, but he still got 55% of the white vote. So at the end of that process, not only me, but a lot of other folks who were involved in that struggle, right, sat down and were trying to figure out, like, what does this mean? And for me, what it meant, see, I knew that 6 out of 10 white people weren't Nazis. I knew that. I knew that 6 out of 10 white people weren't Klansmen. I knew that 6 out of 10 white people weren't overt white supremacists. But now I knew that 6 out of 10 white people were willing to vote for a guy who was all of those things. And so I had to figure out what that meant for me. And what it meant for me was I couldn't sit around anymore and wait for black people to save white people. Because that's what happened, right? If it had been up to white people, we'd elect a Nazi. That's what we would have done. We would have done it twice in either of those elections. But black folks were like, nah, right? 87% turnout came out, stopped us from doing what we were going to do, right? 87% turnout, and obviously all against Duke, well, except for like 2 guys, or like 2 black people who voted for Duke. There are always 2 in any group, right? They just don't quite get the memo, and they go rogue and do some crazy shit. So there were 2 guys, you know, but the rest of everybody got it right, and they saved us. They literally saved us from ourselves. And as I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I was thinking 2 things. 1, it's not right to ask black folks to save us. We have to save us. And 2, I can't be smug and think that I'm better than those white people, right? Because I could have been them and they could have been me. And the only thing that really differentiates us is that I had a series of experiences that took me down one road. They had some other experiences that took them down the other. But for those things, I might be them, and they now, I mean, I was Jewish, so I knew not to go for the Nazis. Sort of comes with the territory too. But ultimately, but that too was just luck, right? I was just born and raised Jewish. Like, that's just a happenstance thing. So I think that for me, that was the moment where all of that early conditioning sort of kicked in, and I realized that it wasn't just something that I could sort of believe or that I could think about or I could dabble with like as a hobby, right? But it was something that I had to do full time, because if I didn't do it, who was going to do it? If white folks don't challenge other white folks, if we don't go out there and try to work with our folks, you know, who's going to do it? Well, I guess people of color, but it's not fair for them to have to do it. And so it was just part of taking on that burden and figuring out, you know, what my role would be in that. Yeah. Other questions? Whoever's got the mic, I don't know who has it. Yes. Mike.
Thank you, Professor Weiss. Besides the narrative that you very eloquently explained between the elites, white men, and the rest of the population,
yeah,
brown, black, yellow, whatever, what is the other narrative that also keep us color people divided? Because you know, we talk here, and black people talk among themselves, and Latinos talk themselves, Asian people talk themselves. So which other part of the hegemony mentality is also upon us and us? So confusing us.
Well, I think it's all the same thing, actually. I think it's a common fountain that's poisoning all of these different folks. And that fountain is a fountain of white supremacy. Here's what I mean by that. White supremacy can only work by doing 2 things. One is tricking those working class and poor whites to throw their lot in with the rich and to bond with the rich. But it also requires dividing and conquering the targets of that system. So it means you have to also turn people of color against one another. So one of the things, I gave the example in the talk, and I gave it also in my new book, about the way that the labor union leaders didn't want people of color in the unions. Well, what the elites would do, the bosses would do, to help stoke the fires of that, because they didn't want more union members, they wanted unions to be weak. So not only did the working class white labor union leaders not want black and brown folks, but the bosses were like, that's great. We don't want them in there either. We want to keep dividing and conquering. So they started setting up their own unions. The bosses would actually, in some cases, set up, in one particular case, they set up a union. It was a dock workers union that was specifically for African American dock workers. And they put a black guy in charge of it as a figurehead. And his argument was, we don't really need unions that fight the boss. We just need, unions that work with the boss. And it was just a figurehead organization. It was a way to turn black folks against white folks, turn black folks against Mexican folk, turn black folks against Asian labor. And it's worked. It's always worked. If you think about what's happening in Los Angeles in the last 10 to 12 years, where a lot of the progress that had been made in some of the gang turf wars of the late 80s and early 90s, much of which had gotten better after the uprising in '92. And there was about a 10-year period where there was a putative truce that was called between the major gang rivals in Los Angeles. The reason that hasn't held in the last 10, 15 years or so as much is because of the same divide and conquer stuff that's happening. So we have black and Latino folks and Salvadoran folks in particular, and some of the Salvadoran gangs and some of the Mexican Americans as well, who are fighting over territory in Los Angeles County that none of them own. They don't own one building. They don't own one part of any of that block. They're fighting over it, and white folks are sitting out in the valley sort of going, oh, this is fascinating, right? And so the black and brown folks are beefing with each other, and when Los Angeles Unified School District, some folks called me up a couple years ago, they wanted me to come speak at one of the schools that had some of this conflict between African American kids and Latino kids. And I said, okay, I'll come and do it, but I need you to know what I'm gonna say. Because if I get up there and start saying it and you cut my mic, we're going to have real problems. So they said, oh, what are you going to say? And I said, I want to talk about white supremacy and how they're being forced to fight one another because the black folks don't know the Chicano history and the Chicano folks don't know the black history, and they don't know the interrelationship of that history, and they're beefing with Asian kids because they don't know that history as well, right? I mean, the reason that Korean shop owners and black folks in places like Los Angeles beef with each other is because neither one of them have to know each other's history, and nobody has to learn indigenous history. Right? So ultimately, you got all these folks fighting, and when I told them that's what I wanted to talk about, they were like, yeah, that's not what we want you to say. We want you to come and say, don't fight each other, don't kill, don't join a gang, put down the guns, try peace. I'm like, y'all have been saying that to them for a long time. If they don't understand what the real source of their conflict is, this is never going to end. They are fighting over the pieces of a pie that none of them own. And the only question that you need to ask them is, who wins? Who wins when you do that? They don't win. The Crips don't win, the Bloods don't win, MS-13 doesn't win, none of those gangs win, none of those communities in which the gangs live win. The only people that win don't live there. And so if you want me to come talk about that, and they're like, no, we don't. So it seems to me that when people of color are fighting one another, it's in part because they haven't been encouraged because of this system of white supremacy. They haven't really been encouraged to understand the way that they have been tricked and turned against one another and are still being tricked and turned. Because you think about some of these anti-immigration rallies, if you look, every anti-immigration rally, every white organizer of that, and the people behind it are all white-led organizations. They always go find a black pastor, though. Yeah. Always go find a black pastor who's got about 11 people in his pews, and they put him, got less parishioners than we got in here, right? But they'll put him up there, Reverend whoever, and he'll talk about Mexicans. And then it's like, see, it's not racist. There's a black guy saying it, And so that's how they get out of it. But that's all the trick. You give somebody who doesn't have any real power a taste of power, make them think that, oh, well, I'm important now because you put me on the dais for the anti-immigrant rally. And then all of a sudden, you got then Chicano folks see that, and now they start to think, well, maybe my enemy is also black. And now you got this conflict, right? And so we keep fighting, and there are black folks that, are not a lot, but there's some that are rallying behind Trump because they actually believe like somehow black folks will be the ones to get the jobs when the Mexicans don't come anymore. Like you think that's what the bosses have not been hiring black people, but all of a sudden when the Mexicans don't come, they're gonna be like, all right, here, have the jobs, black people. Like that's not what's gonna happen. They're not just. There's a reason they don't hire black folks. right? Because of their own biases, because of their own assumptions. That's not going to change just because a different group is being kept out by some kind of a wall. So we just need to understand each other's history. We need to understand, Black and Latino folk have to understand, just like white folks do, the way that the model minority myth is used to perpetuate disparities with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, right? Because that's used as a weapon there. Think about, if you think about the history of that term, I don't know if you know the history of the term, the model minority used to describe Asian, but the history, that term was first coined by Life magazine, US News and World Report, and I believe Newsweek or Look magazine, one of those other magazines from the early 60s. In 1960-61, they started running articles in these magazines. One of them was about Chinese Americans, one was about Japanese Americans. And they used this term, model minority. They basically were saying, if you read the articles, that these Chinese folk, these Japanese folk, they're very hardworking, they have good stable families, and if you read the rest of the article, the subtext is, why can't Black people be like this? Now, think about the context. What's going on in 1961, 1962? This is the height of the civil rights struggle. You have Black folks out demanding equal rights, and now you've got these major media saying, why can't you just work hard like these people? That's a way to try to divide and conquer. It's a way to tell Asian folks, see, you're better than those Black people, so don't join with them. And it's a way to tell those Black people, see, they look down on you, and they're better than you, so you should resent them. Right now, keep in mind the irony, we didn't even lift the immigration restriction on Asian folks until 65, right? So we're saying this stuff in 60, 61, 62, and we still have immigration rules that have been in place since the 1800s, or at least the 1920s, that are basically keeping folks out, and we're getting ready to start bombing Southeast Asia. We had 125,000 Japanese Americans that we locked up in concentration camps, so we've shown over and again, we don't give it, we went in and killed 1 million folks in the Philippines at the turn of the century, so we have a history of showing we don't care about Asian life, but now we're acting like, why can't they all be like these Asian folks who we've always killed and hated, right? And the irony is, it worked. Right? Because there are a lot of folks, when you tell folks that they're a model, there are some folks who will fall for that, right? I mean, I'm Jewish, a lot of folks in the Jewish community have started to believe that stuff, that people have said and that we've told ourselves about, we come from a very educated, hardworking, cultural background. This is nonsense. I'm not saying that we don't, but most people do. The fact of the matter is, when my great-grandfather got off the boat in this city in 1907, or 1908, he was able to get jobs on day one that had been off limits to Black people since the 1880s in this city. So that didn't mean he didn't work hard. It also meant, however, that he had a glide path to jobs and the accumulation of stuff. And so the idea that he didn't come with anything, get 18 cents and a ball of lint, is what we got off Ellis Island, 18 cents and a ball of lint in his pocket. But he had more than that. He also had this skin. He had European ancestry, which meant something. It meant he could become a citizen virtually immediately, whereas people of color could not and had not. So we create these fictive narratives, and sometimes we fall for it. And I think that now we see the way that that's hurting Asian Americans, right? Because there's a lot of inequality within Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Some folks doing okay, other folks, Vietnamese, Thai, Lao, Hmong, Cambodian, having high rates of poverty, very high rates of school failure, very low test scores and low academic achievement, on par with Latino and African Americans in many communities in terms of their economic outcomes, but we don't even see them. They're invisibilized by the model minority myth, but that model minority myth pits them against Black folk and keeps some folk from joining with Black folk, and it keeps Black folk from joining with them, because it's like, if they're told they're better than you, then it's hard to make solidarity with them. But that's all the game. It's all the trick. And it's been working for a very, very long time. So I think part of the whole lesson is that the history is important, not just for white folks to know, but the history for people of color and how they've been played against one another is also critically important. And how their histories intertwine and intersect and interconnect is critically important if we're going to really understand where we are as a people. Next question, please.
We're going to take 3 more questions.
Yeah, we'll do like 2 or 3 more, and then we'll do like 3 more, and then I'll be done.
Okay.
Whoever's got the mic, I'm going to trust y'all to do it. That way I don't have to follow up. Okay, go ahead. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
So my question is for me as a child of immigrants. I heard the similar story. You work hard, and you'll get it, because my grandparents, they came here on a boat. They worked and they bought their own house. My grandmother opened up her own school, and so I hear this narrative as a child of immigrants that all the African Americans, they're just lazy. They work. So how do I help my grandparents understand that even though they did work hard and they did get these things, that there's there's some structural inequalities built into the system that hurt African Americans as well as themselves and their grandchildren?
Well, I mean, there are a couple things, right? One is, by definition, immigrants who leave a country to go to another country are both the losers of their old country, like I said, but by definition, they have this sort of striver mentality, right? They're sort of, by definition, skimmed off the top of whatever place they come from, because the ones who are really at the bottom of where they come from usually don't have the ability to even try to make the effort, right? So, for example, that's what's always interesting to me about, you know, a lot of overtly racist people who will try to say they're not racist because, you know, Asians, you know, like the white nationalist, white supremacist movement will always say, well, we're not really white supremacists because we realize Asians are, you know, much more successful and have higher IQ than white people do. We don't want them around, but we realize that they're smarter than us, right? But the thing about that is there are millions, in fact, there are billions of poor Asians on this planet who live in countries within Asia who are starving right now. They come from the same culture, they have the same DNA, same biological and genetic makeup, so clearly there's nothing about groups, right, that makes them inferior. It has to do with context. And those who are able to come from point A to point B are usually people who have a certain kind of mentality coming in that often does correlate with a certain degree of success. No doubt about that, right? Because you come in with this fresh attitude, you come in without the stigma of having been the hated, the hunted, the oppressed. Whereas people who've been in that country for a significant period of time may have had that attitude in the first generation, right? But after a while, can't always have that. In fact, what we see from immigrant communities from the Caribbean, from Africa, it's interesting, when African immigrants come to the United States, and this is worth asking, first of all, where do they come from?
Jamaica and Dominica.
Okay, so the Caribbean. So we're talking about Caribbean immigrants, but the same is true with African immigrants. What the research says is that folks who come from African nations or black-led nations in the Caribbean, where blackness is the norm, right, have, when they get here, the first generation, the actual migrant, is, the actual immigrant generation, usually has health outcomes that are pretty good. Their health is usually pretty comparable to white folks. Their infant mortality rates are low if they have children here in the States. Their longevity is pretty good. Their life expectancy is good. Their blood pressure numbers are pretty good. So in other words, they sort of have health that's very similar, but one generation later, right? Let alone 2 and 3 and 4. One generation later in this country, their children's health outcomes have now deteriorated and are now on par with African American health outcomes, people who've been in this country for generations. What's going on? The DNA didn't change. The culture didn't change. You were being raised in that immigrant home. You're being raised in that immigrant home with that whole sense of mentality and mission and striving and success, and you're still being subjected to some stuff outside of that home that is having physiological and psychological debilitating health effects on the black body. So it's fantastic that immigrants are able to come and to strive and to succeed, and that's been true in every generation, in every country to which people have ever migrated. That often happens. But if we begin to see that fall backwards in the next generation, then there's something going on that isn't about mindset, because the children of that immigrant tend to have a pretty good mindset too until they get conked over the head enough to realize that, Amadou Diallo was an immigrant and he was shot to death in a vestibule in his city. So it wasn't his fault. It was because of the trigger-happy nature of the street crimes unit of the NYPD. That's why. So I think we just want to look at what the outcomes are one generation later, 2 generations later, and when we see that, when we see how that income falls backward, when we think about the fact that right now African migrants to this country, most people don't realize this, African immigrants to the United States coming straight from the continent of Africa are the group that has the highest average educational attainment of any immigrant group. More than Asian folk, more than European immigrants, 42% of all African immigrants either have a college degree upon arrival or are in the process of finishing up that degree when they get here. So it's a highly educated group. The fact that they do a little better than African American folk who are a cross-section of the, this is a selective group by definition, just like Japanese migrants, just like migrants from subcontinental India, just like, when you have South Asian folks coming disproportionately with degrees, Africans coming disproportionately with degrees, Korean folk coming disproportionately with degrees. It hasn't always been that way, but that's how it is now. Of course, they're gonna look better in the aggregate, right? Because that's not a cross-section. Then you have African Americans that are a cross-section, and you have Chicanos who are actually more of a cross-section, and usually actually from lower working class backgrounds. So naturally, you're going to see some disparities. We just can't allow those disparities to somehow be the end of sociological inquiry. Those are the beginning of sociological inquiry. And it's not about saying that people can't make it, it's about saying, what does a system of justice look like? You know, if I walk by a chemical plant, at the very moment that that plant explodes, and as a result, I'm horribly disabled, or my leg is blown off because of this explosion, it really won't do for someone to say, well, you know, there are lots of one-legged people who do just fine, so just work harder. Like, that's not really an answer to my dilemma, even if that's true. And I should have to work hard and do my best. And look, we tell our kids, work hard, do your best, be the best you that you can be. But the reality is, the system of justice says that even while I'm telling you that, we have an obligation to ensure that injustice is addressed. So the fact that people can make it without help, very nice. Although nobody makes it with no help. We all got some kind of help, right? But even if that were true, it still wouldn't speak to what a just society looks like. And so I think I would honor a parent or grandparents or any relative who has that mentality for what their sacrifices are. But I would suggest that we need to recognize that those sacrifices literally 20 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later, are not being passed down to the children. It's not because the children adopted a different set of values. It's because the children experienced a different set of conditions than what they came from in the Caribbean or from the continent of Africa. A couple more real quick. Who's got the mic? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for coming. And okay, so my question is, it kind of goes back to Michaela's real quick. Would you say that to the privileged class, any kind of equality or some sort of setting defense of a minority group who has an defense kind of feels like oppression in a sense, even though it doesn't exist, but it might feel that way to the privileged because like, oh, you're taking something away. It's like, no, we're not. We're just asking to be equal.
Yeah, no, I think this is part of the dilemma, right? And part of the struggle that we face is that if you have come to believe, because everything has told you that the system is fair and that whatever you've obtained is not because of a rigged game, but because of greater effort, then anything that someone else does to balance the scales is going to seem like oppression, right? If you believe we're at a steady state right now and everything's equal, then anything we do to try to balance the scale seems like you're having something taken. Well, in a sense you are. You're having your ability to bank unearned advantage taken. But that's not something to which you were ever entitled. I was not entitled to the 3-lap head start. You know, it's like if we were to have an 8-lap relay race and I start out 3 laps ahead of you, I am supposed to cross the finish line first. That's how a race works, right? If I have a 7-lap head start, I'm really supposed to cross the finish line first. If I just have a 500-yard head start, I should cross the finish line first. But the problem is in this culture, we're not encouraged to notice where people start on that track. We're only looking at the finish line when the tape gets hit. And so if the tape gets hit, and so, oh, I got a better test score than you. Oh, well, I should be in that school. Or I have a more impressive resume than you. Well, I should have gotten that job. Well, if we don't see all the stuff that happened before that test was taken, before the job was given, then we're not really seeing the race. And so if I don't see that because I don't know that history, right, then it feels like oppression. It feels like somehow I'm having something to which I was entitled taken away from me. Because I'm not seeing everything that came before. It's sort of like, I always go places where when I go to like really elite, schools that have had all these controversies around affirmative action, and they've had these controversies even though, at those schools only about 12% of the students are Black and Latino combined. But supposedly white folks still can't get into Harvard or Georgetown or University of Chicago because Black and brown folks have taken all the gigs. But when I go there, I always will hear someone say, and it speaks to this question you're asking, they'll always say, well, if I were just Black, I'd have gotten into Yale. No. Because see, when you're Black, you're actually Black for 18 years before you even applied to Yale. So you didn't just get to be Black on the day you sent the app in. That's not how that shit works. You were Black when you came out the womb. Your mom and dad were Black. And you came from a Black family and probably in a Black community, which means if you've been Black all of your life, you would have been, 3 times as likely to grow up in poverty, twice as likely with an unemployed parent, 1/15 the net worth, twice as likely to die in infancy. So forget college, you're not even going to preschool, right? This idea that, well, it's just everything would have been the same, but I just would have been Black. That's just not real. But if I don't know why that's not real, because no one has ever explained any of this to me, then all of a sudden I feel marginalized, which is, there was an article yesterday that was going around the web, right, about like the new fraternity thing where like the white frat boys and lacrosse players I don't know why this is the combination, but white fraternity guys and lacrosse players feel like they're the new victims.
Oh, yes.
That's why they're all rallying behind Trump, supposedly, which I think is an exaggeration to say they all are rallying behind Trump, but whatever. And so they're having all this like pro-Trump stuff because they feel like they're getting picked on because they're having to answer for racism or they're being called out on their sexism. You know, as one guy was quoted saying, you know, it's like just because we want to go hook up with girls on spring break, they think we're sexist. And just because we, tell racist jokes, they think we're racist. And we're just, we're being oppressed. I mean, it's like, that's oppression to the person who A, doesn't know what the word means, B, has never had to actually study history, and C, has been lulled into a place of entitlement by privilege. Again, this is horribly debilitating because I think some of these guys that are saying this, like they went to good schools, like they're in, like they gotta have something going on. They got into this, but they still can be so incredibly unformed around this kind of issue. And I think that's because they've never had to think about it. It's incredibly dangerous to never have to think about how you view the world and how inaccurate that view is, right? If I've never had to contend with the world, then all of a sudden I'm not ready for any kind of change. I just can't deal with any change. So if I've grown up in a world where being an American means being white and being middle class and being Christian and being straight and being whatever, and all of a sudden I'm being told, wait a minute, now it's going to be 50% people of color in 30 years and 50% white, and you mean it's not just going to be Christians, we're going to have mosques and Sikh temples, and we're going to have, whatever, and then oh, you mean, and we're going to have marriage equality, and we're going to have LGBTQ rights, and we're going to have all of these things that, like, all of that stuff, oh yeah, and transgender folks can use the bathroom that actually corresponds to their gender identity. Imagine that, right? Like, how can we do that? Because there's an assumption that everything has been normal. And so now all this other stuff seems like everything's being turned upside down instead of being set right. And I think it's going to be a very difficult battle when you have people that have been come to believe in their own entitlement to a certain way of doing things, right? To get them to want to switch when they've never had a reason to have to do it is not going to be easy. I think the only way we can do that is to be honest and really transparent about how dangerous it is to stay in this place where we've been. This is dysfunctional. Being ignorant about the world and how the world works does not keep you safe. And if you need any evidence of that, we can go a few blocks, right, down the road, and you can see what happens to a people who don't understand that there are folks in this world who hate them, right? Because when those buildings came down and folks are running around, notice who didn't do this. Wasn't black folks, wasn't Latino folk, wasn't indigenous people asking, why did they hate us? Not one person of color was confused about it. Even if they were scared and angry, people of color weren't confused that it might be possible for people to hate this country. But white folks were on air day in and day out. I watched it from this city and other cities. Why? Why do they hate us? Why would anybody hate the United States of America? I don't understand. What did we ever do to anybody? See, they didn't ask people of color. They didn't ask folks of color. They didn't go to talk to Lakota folk on Pine Ridge and say, well, why do they hate us? Because if you ask the Lakota, they're going to give you a very different answer than the one that we gave folks, which is, they hate our freedom. See, they don't say that shit on Pine Ridge. Nobody on Pine Ridge like, all this freedom, that's why they hate us. They didn't go up to Washington Heights and ask that question. They didn't go to the South Bronx and ask that question. They didn't go to Ferguson and ask that question. They didn't go to South Side of Chicago or West Chicago and ask that question. So what we know, right, is that was dangerous. Being able to not know how people actually think about you and what the world is like means you let down your guard, whether it's 9/11 or whether it's Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado in 1999, or whether that's letting down your guard to the fact that the dude in the suit can come and take your job and send it to Mexico and you can't do a damn thing about it because you don't have any power because your union's been busted and doesn't have enough power because the labor union movement in general has been busted in this country and politicians won't stand up for you, right? So at the end of the day, like these folks who have come to feel entitled need to understand that mentality of entitlement and expectation is deadly. It will get you dead.
They hate us because we don't even know why they hate us.
Right, exactly right. One more real quick and then I'll let
Our
you get out.
very
Whoever's
last
got the mic will
question.
do. Yes. Go ahead.
I actually am an immigrant, and I'm from Dominica, which is where her grandparents are from. And I should sound like her grandparents because I came to this country. I went to Caltech. I studied astrophysics. I did quantum physics research. My first child went to Columbia. My second child went to Yale. I've gotten all the fruits. I went on from science to Wall Street. I own a hedge fund, but I think like you, on steroids. I couldn't be more desperate for grandparents. Let me tell you about my 30 years outside of the United States.
Yeah.
Zero bad cop interactions. I had zero bad police interactions in different countries outside of the United States. Living in Dominica, living in Europe, in Italy, Spain. I mean, countries where I really stand out.
Yeah.
They don't follow me around. They don't stalk me. Come back to New York, and it's the same. I can't even go out running in the mornings here in this country. I get into confrontations with the police. They arrest me. Yeah, I've been locked up on Rikers. A physicist, locked up on Rikers. Look at me, I'm a nerd.
Probably the only hedge fund manager ever locked up.
Thank you.
Not because a lot of them don't deserve to be, but because.
And believe me, I know far better than you.
Oh, I bet you do. I bet you do.
I could write a few books on that. I have privilege. I have immigrant privilege.
Sure.
It's big. I grew up in a kind environment. It was safe. There was no hateful majority around me kicking at me emotionally to the degree that I've seen my children experience here.
Right.
I see that next generation, and I see why they might live a shorter time than I might. Because the things they went through from kindergarten blew my mind. Just blew my mind.
Yeah.
It's amazing stuff. So, I should be like your grandparents, but I'm not.
Well, what's interesting, let me just say this, and thank you so much for sharing that, because that's a really powerful narrative. And I do hope you write those books that you could write, because that's really important stuff to hear, incredibly important stuff to hear. And if you want to write them, please get in touch with me, and I'll try to help hook you up and connect you with folks who might be interested in doing that.
I will.
So contact me through my website, and I'll do what I can to try to steer you towards it, because that's an important narrative. And I want to if you have time amidst all the other stuff you're doing, which is obviously more than like all of us combined, it's incredibly intimidating. But hey, if you want to be an author too, let's do that. I'm serious. No, but here's the thing too about the immigrant experience that's different, right? At least in that first generation, and then how it changes. So when I was in school in Nashville, growing up around 1979. There was a girl who came to Nashville, 5th grade, and she and her family had gotten out of what became Zimbabwe, but it was still an apartheid country. It was when it was Rhodesia, right? And so they had left in '78, I guess, before the fall of the apartheid system there. And her dad, I think, was a doctor, and her name was Rudo, and she was a really nice kid. No one quite knew what to make of her because she was from Africa, and we didn't know a lot of folks. There weren't a lot of African immigrants in Nashville at that particular time. What was interesting about Rudo's experience, right, was, at least from this third-person observation, it was really evident to me that the teachers loved Rudo. Right? And by that, I'm not saying she faced no racism. I'm sure she did, but the teachers made her over. Now, ask yourself why. You think it's because Rudo was dark, right? I mean, she was Zimbabwean. She was from Southern Africa. She was dark. And yet they made over Rudo and in fact would contrast her with African Americans, right? It was sort of like, because that's what happens when you first come, but now in future generations they stop doing that. But that first immigrant, those early years, right, it's like, oh, you're so articulate, you speak so well. And listen, the Southern African accent is one of the most beautiful accents on the planet. So I get where that thought comes from, but here's the irony of it. They're treating her well. She was the one black kid in the honors classes that I recall. In any of my honors type advanced level classes, we had these classes, just to give you an idea of how not subtle it used to be in the 70s, right? They didn't even call them honors, they called it like VE, which stood for very exceptional. It's like, yes, you're the very exceptional students, and you're gonna go down the hall and get the enrichment programs. Well, Rudo was the only black kid that was in that. And it created a rift between her and African American students, right? That didn't need to exist, but these teachers would say things like, God, she speaks so well, and she just is so nice and so well behaved. Why can't they be like that, right? Now I have no doubt that the longer Rudo stayed in this country, and I've lost touch with her, I haven't seen her since junior high school, I have no doubt that she has seen the other side of that, but that's that divide and conquer too. And I don't even know if those teachers realized what they were doing. I don't know if they even were consciously doing it, or it doesn't matter though, right? Because the outcome is the same, conscious or not. They're setting up a divide and conquer thing, and they're treating her special. Now, what's the irony of it? The irony is 6 months before she set foot in that Nashville classroom, she was sitting in a Rhodesian classroom with the same accent, with the same ability, with the same intelligence, with the same erudition, with the same qualities, and she was a second-class citizen in that country. So she's the same Rudo that she was 6 months earlier, but now she serves a function. And the function she serves, the same thing happened in Nashville a couple of years back. They had a big thing about Sudanese refugees when folks were coming from Sudan. And there was a white church in Nashville that had rolled out the red carpet. They were doing all this stuff for Sudanese refugees, trying to hook them up with social services, hook them up with whatever, right? Which is great. Like, that's wonderful. That's what you should do for refugee folks. I mean, that's great. But the problem was, and there was a reporter, I didn't even know we had good reporters like this at the paper local. But he was smart enough, he went to talk to the pastor of this white church. And he said, you know, just sort of curious, like why, have you ever thought about why it is that you've done all of this stuff for these refugee folks from Africa, but you've never done this, to my knowledge, for black folks who live like a mile and a half over that way and have been here all the time. And this pastor, to his credit, after he was asked that question by the reporter, to his credit, the pastor says, you know, I never thought of it, but now that you ask it, he said, maybe it's because deep down, like, we look at the refugee folks and we think, you know, they wanted to be like us. That's why they came here, right? In other words, it serves the function of reinforcing the narrative of how great we are. Whereas when he looks at African American folk, you know that's not how black folks got here, right? He knows that it wasn't about choice and like, oh, we just want to be one of you and we want to come join you. And so when he looks at African Americans, he has to actually deal with the history. Even if he doesn't have to deal with it, you know what I mean? He has to actually stare it in the face. He can look at the immigrant, as long as they still have the accent, and as long as it's that first generation, but now the next generation, like you said, all bets are off. But that first generation, it serves a function, and that function is recreating hierarchy and dividing and conquering black folk from black folk. Not even black folk from brown folk, just black folk from black folk, to where we get the kind of narrative that divides and keeps people at each other's throats. So I think that's a huge piece of it too that we want to grapple with, because this thing is you know, it's so much more complex than we've been led to believe, and it burrows into our brains in ways that colonizes our minds as much as it colonizes land. And if it weren't for the ability to colonize the minds of the target group, white supremacy wouldn't be nearly as effective as it is. It colonizes, creates internalized supremacy, creates internalized oppression. Those are two sides of one coin, which is to say that if we're going to get free, everybody's going to have to recognize that source of common injury. It's not to say that we've been injured to the same extent, because obviously white folks who I think suffer from a system of inequality in the long run, we're not suffering in the short run, and we're not suffering as much because we're not the target. We're the collateral damage. But make no mistake that the source of the damage, whether it's direct, indirect, first primary, or secondary, right, is the same fountain, the same toxic source of energy that's creating all this damage for all of us combined. Thank you all so much for being here.
I'm talking to Felicia.
Okay, excellent.
And I'm a grad student in psychology at Penn State, so I'm trying to get you to come to Penn State sometime.
That'd be great. That'd be great. Love to do that.
Excellent.
And we're having a small reception in the reading room.
All right. Let's break out, baby.
Yeah, can I look real quick?
Yes, ma'am.